Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I remember that day because everything seemed to go wrong from the start. I left work late and I wanted to get home as soon as possible. I got into my car and planned to drive straight back without any stops. The traffic was heavy and I got impatient. I saw a side road that looked like it might cut through the forest and lead me home faster. I had never taken that route before, but I was in a hurry. I turned off the main road and drove into the woods. The asphalt turned into dirt and the trees got thicker. The light started to fade and I felt uneasy, but I kept going. After a few minutes, the car started acting strange. The headlights flickered and the engine sputtered. I tried to push the gas pedal gently, but the car jerked forward and then slowed down. I pressed the pedal again and the engine gave out a choking sound. Then it stopped completely. I turned the key again. Nothing. I tried 2 more times. The engine clicked but never caught. I sighed and looked around. I saw trees and bushes. I saw no houses, no other cars, no lights. The sun was going down, and the forest was quiet. My phone had no signal. I checked 3 times, waving it around like it would help. It didn't. I opened the hood. I am not a mechanic, but I tried to check the battery cables and see if anything looked loose. The engine smelled like hot metal. I touched a few parts, but I had no tools. Everything looked fine to me, but I had no clue what I was doing. After a while, I gave up and leaned against the car. I listened. I only heard the faint sound of wind in the trees. My heart was beating a little faster now. I tried to think clearly. Maybe I could walk back to the main road. But I had driven quite far and it was already getting dark. The forest looked thick and hard to navigate. The dirt road in front of me disappeared into darkness. The idea of walking alone on foot in this place made me nervous. I got back into the car and locked the doors. The windows were rolled up. I turned on the interior light, but I didn't want to drain the battery completely. I shut it off again. It felt strange to just sit there in the dark. I tried the engine one more time. No luck. The silence pressed in. I started to notice every sound. The creaking of a branch, the rustling of leaves, my own breathing. My heart thumped harder. I told myself to calm down. It was just a breakdown. No one was out here. I would spend a few hours, maybe sleep, and in the morning I would walk back to the road or maybe find a better signal for my phone. Then I saw something move in the corner of my eye. I looked through the windshield. The headlights were off, so I saw only dim shapes. My eyes adjusted slowly. I stared at the tree line. I thought I saw a figure between 2 trees. I focused on that spot. Something was there. I flicked the headlights on for a second. The beams lit up the area. There was a shape of a person standing behind a large tree trunk about 20 feet ahead. The figure had no distinct features. I could see a human shape, but I saw no face. The second I turned the headlights on, it jerked its head to the side. I clicked the headlights off again, hoping maybe it had just been my imagination. My chest tightened. I felt sweat on my forehead. I held my breath and waited. I turned the headlights on again. The figure was still there. Now it stood in front of the trunk facing me. I tried to see its face, but I couldn't. Its head was smooth with no eyes, no mouth, nothing. It looked like a blank oval. It wore some kind of dull, dark clothing. Nothing stood out about its body except that it had arms and legs. It didn't move closer, but it also didn't step back. I turned the headlights off again and just sat there. I didn't know what to do. My skin felt cold and my hands were shaking. I looked at my phone again. Still no signal. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was a person wearing a mask. Maybe some kind of weirdo who hung around in the woods. I whispered to myself that it couldn't be something impossible. It had to be a person messing with me. But what kind of person stands still in a forest with no face? I couldn't figure it out. I decided that staying in the car might be safer than going outside. The doors were locked. The windows were rolled up. If it tried to break in, I could at least hold the horn and maybe scare it off. I wanted to see if it was still there. I turned the headlights on again. This time the figure was closer by a few steps. It stood in the middle of the road ahead, turned toward the car. It still had no face. It did not raise its arms or do anything. I could see the outline of its shoulders. It looked human in shape. I quickly turned the headlights off and cursed under my breath. My heart was pounding hard and I felt my throat tighten. I could not believe this was happening. I tried to think of a way out. The forest was dark and thick. Running into it on foot would be risky, especially with some stranger lurking around. Staying in the car didn't feel safe either, but at least the car offered some barrier. I waited. I listened for footsteps. I heard leaves crunching softly. I held my breath. The sound seemed to move around the car. I locked the doors again to be sure. I tried to look through the side windows, but it was too dark. I pressed my ear to the car door to listen. The sound stopped. I thought maybe it left. I turned the headlights on again and aimed them toward the spot where I first saw it. Nothing there. I swung the wheel a bit and turned the lights to the left side. I saw it standing there, just off the side of the road behind some bushes. I turned the headlights off again. I was shaking. My hands were sweaty. I could feel my pulse in my neck. I tried to calm my breathing, but I couldn't. I kept staring into the darkness, hoping to see nothing. It went on like this for hours. The darkness felt endless. My phone screen said it was almost midnight. I tried turning the engine again. Still nothing. The battery seemed to be losing strength. The headlights were dimmer each time I tried them. I stopped turning them on, worried I'd drain the battery completely. I only turned them on when I couldn't stand the uncertainty anymore. Every time I did, I saw that thing somewhere around the car. It never came right up to the window. It never touched the car. It stayed a short distance away, half hidden behind a tree or a bush, always facing the car. I felt my stomach growl. I had no food with me. I had a small bottle of water in the glove compartment. I sipped it slowly. My mouth was dry. I tried to think straight. Maybe I could run for it. If I ran straight down the road, maybe I could reach the main road in a couple of hours. But what if it followed me? What if it was faster than me? I wasn't in great shape. I tried to think if I could use something as a weapon. I looked around the car. I had a tire iron in the trunk, but that meant going outside. I didn't want to do that. I had a small flashlight in the center console. I clicked it on. A weak beam of light. Better than nothing. I turned the interior light on just for a second and looked around the car for anything else useful. A jacket, a half-empty bag of chips under the seat, an umbrella, my work bag with some papers. Nothing helpful. I turned the interior light off and waited. The silence was heavy. My neck was stiff from sitting so tensely. I tried to crack it, but the sound was too loud in the quiet. I froze, listening. I heard a rustle outside, maybe 10 feet away. I couldn't see anything now that I had no headlights on. The flashlight was too weak to shine outside the car very far. I decided to try something else. I tapped the horn lightly. A short honk. Then I waited. Nothing happened at first. I honked again, a bit longer. Then I heard quick steps, leaves crunching, like it was running back into the deeper woods. I thought maybe I scared it away. I felt a small bit of relief. Maybe it got startled. Maybe it left for good. I waited a few minutes. I tried the horn again. No answer. No movement. My heart rate slowed a bit. I wiped sweat off my forehead. I felt a chill on my arms. The night air was getting colder. After about 15 minutes, I turned the flashlight on and pointed it outside. I scanned the trees. Nothing. I kept looking, moving the beam slowly. Still nothing. I felt a small sense of hope. Maybe it really left. I considered stepping out and trying to fix the car again or checking if I could push it a bit, but I stayed put. I didn't want to take the risk. I turned the flashlight off and sat in darkness again. I closed my eyes for a moment, but every sound made them snap open again. Time passed slowly. I looked at my phone. 2 in the morning. Still no signal. I tried to send a text, but it failed. I sat there, fighting off panic, trying to stay calm. I told myself I just needed to last until morning. When the sun came up, I would feel safer. I might be able to see where I was going. Maybe I could fix the car in daylight or walk out of here without feeling like I was being stalked. I heard a branch snap nearby. I grabbed the flashlight and pointed it at the side window. I saw the figure again, much closer now, standing right next to the bushes along the side of the road. I could see its shape clearly in the dim light. It had a head with no face, a torso, and long arms. It stood very still. The flashlight beam was weak, but I could see it tilt its head slightly. I felt my heart pounding again. My hands were shaking. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. I didn't know what to say. I whispered, "What do you want?" There was no response. I turned the flashlight off. I didn't want to see it anymore. I put my head against the steering wheel and tried to breathe slowly. I could smell the stale air of the car. My clothes felt damp from sweat. I wanted to be anywhere else. I checked the doors again, still locked. I heard it move around the front of the car, a light scraping sound like a shoe against dirt. I lifted my head and looked through the windshield. Without the headlights, I saw almost nothing, just a vague outline of the trees. I felt trapped. I wanted to scream, but I controlled myself. I tapped the horn again. It echoed in the silence. I waited. I didn't hear it run away this time. I waited several minutes listening. Then I heard a soft thump on the roof. Just once. A single thump. My whole body stiffened. I pointed the flashlight upward, but I couldn't see the roof from inside. I stayed still, listening for more sounds. Nothing else came. I tried not to panic. I knew staying in the car was probably still safer than going outside. I waited a long time. My watch said it was almost 4 in the morning. The forest remained dark, but I sensed that dawn would come in a couple of hours. I just had to hold on. I didn't hear any more sounds for a while. I started to wonder if it left again. My eyes were heavy, but every time my head bobbed forward, I'd jerk awake. I fought to stay alert. Around 5, I noticed the sky starting to lighten just a bit. The trees were still dark shapes, but I could see more detail. I could see the hood of the car, the outline of the side mirror, the branches overhead. I looked around carefully. I didn't see the figure. I didn't hear it. The silence felt a bit calmer now that I could see a hint of morning light. As the light grew stronger, I finally decided to take a chance. I unlocked the door quietly and stepped outside. I stood next to the car, holding my flashlight like a club. My legs were stiff. My back ached. I looked around in all directions. I saw no one. I listened. I only heard birds now chirping somewhere far off. I popped the trunk and grabbed the tire iron. I felt safer holding it. I checked under the hood, but I had no idea what to fix. I closed the hood and decided to start walking. I figured I could follow the dirt road back the way I came and reach the main road eventually. I walked slowly at first, glancing behind me often. The forest floor was damp and soft. I saw no footprints except my own. I didn't see any sign of that figure. I walked for about an hour, and the sun rose above the treetops. I reached the main road, breathing hard, but relieved. I still had no signal on my phone, but I knew if I followed the main road, I would find someone eventually. I just kept walking. My heart was still beating fast. I turned around once or twice, checking the forest edge. I saw nothing unusual. I never figured out what that thing was. I don't know if it was a person or something else. It never spoke. It never attacked me. It just watched. I'm not sure what it wanted, but I know I won't take that shortcut again. I won't drive into unfamiliar woods at night. Next time, I'll deal with traffic. It's better than spending a night like that, trapped in a broken-down car, with something without a face standing in the darkness, watching and waiting. I felt my stomach tighten again just thinking about it. But at least now I was back on a real road, and I kept walking, focusing on each step, grateful for the daylight and the distance I was putting between me and that silent figure. I heard the intercom ring right after midnight. I was sitting on my couch flipping through TV channels trying to find something that would help me fall asleep. The apartment was quiet. I had turned off the overhead lights, leaving only a small lamp on the side table. I remember feeling a slight chill in the room, but that might have been my imagination. The apartment building was usually calm at this hour. The street outside was dark and empty. I got up and walked over to the intercom panel mounted on the wall near the kitchen. The old speaker crackled a bit. I pressed the button and said, "Hello?" There was a long hiss, then a man's voice. "Let me in." I didn't recognize the voice. I squinted at the small window facing the street. From that angle, I could see the building's front door and the intercom panel outside. There was a single dim streetlight and the glow from a distant sign, but I saw no one standing there. The doorway was empty. The sidewalk was empty. The voice on the intercom was calm and quiet, but I saw absolutely no one. I leaned close to the speaker and said, "Who is it?" I heard nothing but static. I waited a few seconds and asked again, "Hello? Who are you?" The line went silent. I stood there, staring at the intercom, a little confused. I waited. Nothing. After about 30 seconds, I let go of the talk button. I walked to the window again and looked out carefully. The front of the building was completely still. No cars passing by, no people walking, just darkness and the weak light from the street lamp. I shrugged to myself, thinking maybe it was some kind of prank. I sat back on the couch and tried to focus on the TV, but my heart was beating a bit faster. A few minutes later, the intercom buzzed again. This time I rushed over and pressed the button right away. "Yeah?" I said, keeping my voice low. "Let me in," the same male voice said. It sounded a bit muffled, like someone talking through a thin cloth. I leaned against the wall, trying to control my breathing. I looked out the window again, pressing my forehead against the cold glass. There was no one there. I glanced down at the time on my phone, 12:10 a.m. I turned back to the intercom. "I don't see you." "Who are you?" I asked. No response, just a faint crackle. My throat felt dry. I grabbed a glass from the kitchen sink and drank some water. The intercom didn't ring again for several minutes. I stood there waiting, staring at that little box on the wall. I considered calling the police, but what would I say? Someone was pressing my intercom, but I couldn't see them? It sounded stupid. I decided to ignore it. Maybe some drunk guy was messing around. I returned to the couch and turned up the volume on the TV, but I couldn't focus on what I was watching. Every small sound in the apartment made me tense. After what felt like 10 minutes, the intercom buzzed again. This time I jumped up so fast I almost tripped. I pressed the button and shouted, "What do you want?" The same calm voice. "Let me in." I felt my stomach tighten. I pressed the talk button and said, "I don't know who you are. Go away." My voice cracked a bit. I tried to look out the window again, pressing my cheek against the cool glass, turning my head to get a better angle. No one. I could see the intercom panel clearly. There was definitely no one standing there. I decided to check the hallway. I unlocked my apartment door and opened it slightly, peering out into the dimly lit corridor. Everything seemed normal. The elevator was still, the floor silent. I listened carefully. No footsteps. I closed and locked my door again. I placed a chair against the doorknob. I didn't know why, it just felt safer. I walked back to the window, checking outside once more. Empty. The intercom didn't ring for a while. I sat in the armchair next to the window, keeping an eye on the outside. Occasionally, a light breeze moved some papers on the street, but there were no cars, no neighbors coming home, nobody smoking outside, nothing. Eventually, I heard the intercom buzz again. By then, it was probably close to 12:30 a.m. I felt a pulse in my neck. I went to the device and pressed the button, not saying anything. The voice repeated, "Let me in," without any change in tone. I said, "I'm not letting anyone in. I don't see you out there. Stop this." I released the button and listened. I heard only static. My palms were sweating. I wiped them on my sweatpants. I tried turning off the intercom system. The cover on the panel didn't come off easily. I got a small screwdriver from the kitchen drawer and tried to loosen the screws. They seemed stripped. I tried unplugging it from the wall. It was hardwired, so no simple plug. Frustrated, I hit the panel with the palm of my hand. Nothing happened. I called the building's superintendent on my cell phone. It rang, but no one answered. I considered calling a friend, but it was late, and I wasn't even sure what I would say. I just stood there, breathing through my mouth, trying to keep calm. The intercom rang again. I shouted at it, "Go away, I'm calling the cops." I listened for a response. The voice just said, "Let me in." I could feel my heart thumping in my ears. I looked at the window again. Still nobody there. I pressed the talk button and asked, "How are you calling from the intercom if you're not outside?" No answer. I pressed it again and said, "Where are you?" Silence. I decided to check the lobby. I grabbed my keys and a small flashlight I keep in a drawer. I moved the chair away from the door and stepped into the hallway. My apartment's hallway light was the usual warm yellow. Nothing strange. I walked to the elevator and pressed the button. It arrived quickly. The ride down was quiet except for the hum of the elevator motor. I reached the lobby. The lobby lights were on. Everything looked normal. The mailboxes on the wall, the mat on the floor, the glass door leading to the street. I walked up to the front door and looked outside through the glass. The intercom panel is right there. I looked closely. I stepped outside for a second, keeping the door propped open with my foot. The sidewalk was empty. The street was quiet. I stood there for a good minute, scanning the area, listening for footsteps, breathing softly. I could hear a distant sound of a car engine somewhere far away, but no one nearby. I stepped back into the lobby, letting the door close gently behind me. The intercom on the outside didn't look tampered with. It was just a small metal box with a button and a speaker. I pressed the button from outside, testing it. I could hear a faint crackle from inside. Everything seemed normal. As I walked back to the elevator, I felt a sudden vibration in my pocket. I pulled out my cell phone. No signal. That was strange. I usually had at least a bar or two, even in the lobby. I tried the building's landline phone, the one mounted on the lobby wall. It was dead. No dial tone. I stared at it for a few seconds. I tried flipping the light switches in the lobby. They worked fine. Just the phone was out. I went back into the elevator and pressed my floor. The doors closed with a soft clang. As I rose, I tried to think clearly. Someone was using the intercom. I couldn't see them. The phone was out. I told myself it could be a technical problem. Maybe the voice was a recording. Maybe some circuit was messed up, repeating a recorded message. I tried to calm myself with that explanation. But the voice responded to me when I asked something the first time. It said, "Let me in," right after I asked, "Hello?" That wouldn't make sense for a recording. When I got back to my floor, I noticed a slight buzzing sound in the hallway, like a faint electrical hum. I walked slowly back to my apartment, keeping my eyes on the closed doors of my neighbors. No one came out. I inserted my key into my door and stepped inside. I locked it again. I moved the chair back against it. I tried calling the police with my cell phone, but I had no service. I walked around my apartment, holding the phone near the windows, trying to get a signal. Nothing. The intercom rang again. The sound made me jerk back. It was sharper this time, like a sudden bark. I approached slowly and pressed the button. Before I could say anything, the voice said, "Let me in." I tried to steady my breathing. I pressed the button and spoke slowly. "If you don't tell me who you are, I'm not opening the door. I can't see you out there." I waited. Nothing, just static. I released the button. I walked to the window and looked down. The same scene. Empty sidewalk, dim light. Nothing else. My head was starting to hurt. I felt sweat on my forehead. My t-shirt was sticking to my back. I wiped my face with my sleeve. My mouth was dry. I tried drinking more water. The apartment's silence pressed against my ears. Every small sound, my breathing, the creak of the floor, the hum of the fridge, felt too loud. I tried turning on the TV again, just for some noise. I flicked through channels, but nothing helped. I turned it off. I stood next to the intercom, waiting for it to ring again. For a while, nothing happened. Maybe 10 minutes passed. I glanced at my phone's clock. It was only about 1 a.m. This had all happened in an hour. It felt longer. The intercom rang again. I sucked in a breath through my teeth. I pressed the button. The voice repeated, "Let me in." This time I asked, "Why?" Nothing. I pressed again. "I'm not opening the door. Leave." The speaker hissed, then popped. I tapped the panel with my finger. The voice didn't come back. I pressed the talk button and said, "Hello?" Silence. I stepped away and watched the intercom for several minutes. No sound. I decided to try something different. I walked back down to the lobby again, this time using the stairs. I wanted to see if maybe I could catch whoever it was off guard. The stairwell was quiet. The concrete steps felt cold under my feet. My shoes squeaked on the floor. When I reached the lobby, I peered through the small window in the door before entering. It was empty, just as before. I opened the door slowly. No one there. I looked outside again. No movement. I stayed there a full 2 minutes, scanning the street. Nothing. I returned to the elevator and headed back up. On the way, the light in the elevator flickered once. My chest tightened. I swallowed hard. The elevator reached my floor without further problems. When I got back into my apartment, I locked it again and leaned against the door, breathing slowly, trying to stay calm. The intercom rang again. It made my heart pound. I walked over, pressed the button. "I'm not letting you in," I said. The voice said nothing this time. Instead, I heard breathing. Just slow, steady breathing. I listened, holding my finger on the button. My hand shook slightly. I asked, "What do you want?" The breathing continued for a few seconds, then stopped. I let go of the button, waiting. I pressed it again. "If you can hear me, just tell me who you are." No response. I released it. The intercom went silent. I stared at it. The seconds dragged by. I could hear my heartbeat. Then it rang again. I almost dropped the phone I was holding. I pressed the button and shouted, "Cut it out!" The voice said, "Let me in." It sounded closer this time, louder, as if leaning into the microphone. My muscles felt tense. I could feel my jaw clenching. My legs were stiff. I tried to relax them, but it was hard. I was on edge. I didn't want to open the door. I didn't know what would happen if I pressed the door release. The thought of doing so made me sweat even more. I paced around the living room, eyeing the intercom as if it were alive. It stayed quiet. I stood still, waiting. After a few minutes, it rang again. I pressed the button. The voice repeated, "Let me in." I didn't answer this time. I just listened. The voice did not add anything. It didn't curse at me, didn't threaten me, didn't try to explain. Just the same request over and over. I tried to control my breathing. I felt a prickling sensation on my neck. My stomach was tight. I turned around and walked away from the intercom, refusing to press the button again. It rang again. I ignored it. It rang again, and again, and again. My head started to pound. I gritted my teeth and walked to the kitchen, looking for something to cut the power. I found the circuit breaker panel behind a small door. I flipped every switch, plunging my apartment into darkness. The fridge stopped humming. The lights went out. The TV died. Everything was silent. But the intercom rang again. I stood there in the dark, only the faint glow of the outside streetlight filtering through the window. I moved slowly back to the panel on the wall. I pressed the button, my voice shaking. "There is no power. How are you still calling?" The voice just said, "Let me in." I stood in the dark, holding the intercom button, feeling my heart thumping. I couldn't see much, but I could feel sweat dripping down my face. My t-shirt clung to my body. I licked my dry lips and tried to form words. I couldn't think of anything to say. Finally, I said, "No," and released the button. I stumbled to the window, looked outside. The street was the same as before, empty, no sign of anyone. I stayed by the window for a long time. The intercom rang a few more times, each time I ignored it. My body felt heavy. My legs ached. After what seemed like hours, it stopped ringing. The silence felt thick. I waited in the darkness until my eyes adjusted. The intercom remained silent. I considered flipping the breakers back on, but I didn't move. I just stood there, leaning against the wall, breathing, waiting for something else to happen. Eventually, I pulled a chair near the window and sat, facing the street. I watched until my eyes burned. Nothing changed. The intercom stayed silent. By the time the sky began to lighten, I was still awake, sitting in that chair, stiff and sore, watching an empty street. The voice never explained anything. It never identified itself. It never stopped asking to be let in. But I never opened that door. I never saw anyone outside. And when the sun rose, the intercom remained quiet. I stayed alert for a long time after that, listening for the slightest sound. But all I heard was my own breathing in an empty apartment. I remember the first time I heard the knocking. It was around 1 in the morning. I was sitting in bed, half awake, trying to settle down after a long day at work. I had nothing strange on my mind that night. I was not distracted. I was just lying there, looking at the dark ceiling. Then I heard 3 short knocks on the glass. It was a tapping sound, a hollow knock on my bedroom window. I sat up right away. I looked at the window, but the curtains were drawn. I listened, but I heard nothing else. I thought it might be something outside. I knew I lived on the 3rd floor of a tall building, so no one could be out there knocking. I shrugged it off as some random sound. Maybe it was the wind or a bird. I tried to sleep, but I kept replaying the sound in my head. I thought about it for a few minutes and then finally fell asleep, assuming it would never happen again. The next night, I heard the knocking again, at almost the same time. This time I was ready. I had been sitting in bed reading on my phone, waiting to see if it would happen. Right around 1 in the morning, I heard 3 short taps on the window. I froze. My chest felt tight. I could feel my heartbeat in my neck. I pulled the curtain aside, careful not to make noise, and looked out. I saw the dark shape of the building across the street, a few dim lights in some apartments, and nothing else. The glass was clean. No branches or pipes were near my window. There was a slight breeze, but nothing unusual. I listened hard, but I heard no flapping wings or rustling. Just that silence you get in the early morning. After a minute or two, I gave up and dropped the curtain back. My room was quiet again. I went to sleep unsettled, but I managed to doze off after an hour or so. On the 3rd night, the same thing happened at the same time. 3 knocks. Light, but firm, right on the glass. I reacted faster this time. The instant I heard it, I jumped out of bed and pulled the curtain aside. I pressed my face against the glass and looked straight down. Nothing. I looked left and right, focusing on the window frame. No cracks, no marks, nothing that could cause a knocking sound. I leaned back and stood there in my shorts and t-shirt, my arms tense. The hair on my arms stood up. I tried opening the window quickly. I lifted it up and stuck my head out. I looked around. The street below was empty. A few parked cars, some street lights, a quiet sidewalk. No animals, no people. I looked up, saw some higher floors. Nothing. After a minute of feeling the cold air on my face, I closed the window and went back to bed. I could feel sweat forming under my arms, even though my room was not hot. My stomach felt weird, like I had swallowed something heavy. I slept badly that night. The next morning, I decided to do something about it. I felt uneasy, and my eyes were sore from poor sleep. After breakfast, I went outside and walked around the building to check if there was something that could tap against my window from outside. My bedroom window faced the street. There was nothing near it. No tree branches reached that high. There were no cables tapping against the glass. My window did not face a balcony. It was just a straight drop down to the sidewalk. The building was made of concrete and glass. No loose gutter or anything like that. I saw nothing that could explain the noise. I went back inside feeling irritated. That night I stayed awake until 1 in the morning. When the knocking came, I had my phone ready. I jumped out of bed, pulled the curtain, and aimed my phone's flashlight at the window. I saw nothing. I opened the window and stuck my arm out, holding my phone, shining the light around. I saw only the building across the street, some windows shut, some lights off. I leaned out a bit, looked up and down. Nothing. I stayed there for a while, my arm getting tired, the cool air making my skin prickle. After a couple of minutes, I pulled back and shut the window. My heart was still beating fast, and I felt a dull ache behind my eyes. I did not sleep well. Over the next few days, I tried different approaches. One night, I decided to go to bed earlier, thinking maybe it would not happen if I fell asleep first. But it woke me up at 1 in the morning, as always. 3 knocks, no more, no less. I jumped up, turned on the bedroom light, and stared at the window. The knocking had stopped. I checked the time on my phone, 1:02 a.m. It was always around that time. I tried leaving the curtains open so I could see the window. The next night, the knocks came again. I was looking right at the glass when I heard them, but I did not see any movement, no shadow, no reflection of anything unusual. Just 3 dull taps. My teeth clenched. My throat felt dry. I got out of bed and touched the glass. It was cold and smooth. I checked the locks, the frame, the outside ledge. Nothing seemed off. I started to get nervous before bedtime. Each night around midnight, I would start to feel anxious, waiting for that sound. I tried listening to music on my headphones to distract myself, but as 1 in the morning approached, I would pause the music, pull off the headphones, and wait. The knocks would come and I would rush to the window. I tried yelling once. Right after I heard it, I shouted, "Who's there?" I kept my voice low but firm. No answer. I tried tapping back on the glass. I knocked 3 times with my knuckles. Nothing happened. I listened for footsteps or voices outside, but the street was always quiet. Sometimes a car passed in the distance, but that was it. I talked to the building manager one afternoon. He stood in the lobby, arms crossed, looking at me with a puzzled expression. He said he had no complaints from other tenants. He suggested it might be something in the pipes or the heating system. But I knew the difference between a knock on glass and a knock inside a pipe. This was on the window, not in the walls. I thanked him and left. I considered talking to neighbors, but I did not know them well. I was not sure what they would say. Most people in the building kept to themselves. No one had mentioned anything strange. I tried recording the sound one night. I placed my phone on the bed and hit the record button a few minutes before 1 in the morning. I waited quietly, lying there, staring at the window. My breathing felt shaky. My stomach was tense. The knocks came at the usual time. I checked the recording. I heard 3 faint taps, nothing else. It was real. I had proof. But proof of what? Just some knocks. I tried to look closely at the window frame. The next day, I examined every inch of it. I saw no cracks or loose fittings. The screws were tight. The edges were sealed. I pressed on the glass from inside. It did not rattle. I pushed on the frame. It was solid. A few nights later, I tried staying away from my bedroom around that time. I sat in my living room, which faced a different direction. I left the bedroom door open so I could hear if it happened. Right at 1 in the morning, I heard the knocks again. This time I ran into the bedroom. I wanted to see if I could catch something leaving. I flicked the light on and rushed to the window. Nothing outside. The silence was almost painful. I stood there breathing hard, my hands shaking. I felt sweat on my forehead and wiped it off with my arm. I started to feel tired all the time. My sleep schedule got messed up. I tried going out late at night so I would not be in the room at 1 in the morning. I walked around the block, got home at 2 or 3. but when I came back, my room felt off. I would check the window, run my fingers along the glass. I thought I noticed tiny marks near the edges, but they were too small to be sure. Maybe they had always been there. I touched them and felt nothing but smooth glass. I even tried cleaning the window with a microfiber cloth, hoping that if there was something stuck outside, I would hear it scrape. But I heard nothing. One night I decided to set up a simple trap. I took some tape and paper and tried to position them on the outside edge of the window frame. The idea was to see if something disturbed it. I had to lean out and do it carefully. My heart was pounding while I did this. I felt uncomfortable leaning out of a third-floor window, holding onto the frame with one hand and taping bits of paper with the other. I checked from the street below beforehand to make sure no one was around watching me. After I finished, I closed the window and pulled the curtain. That night, the knocks came as usual. In the morning, I checked the paper. It looked untouched. The tape was still intact. No scratches, no tears. My frustration grew. I tried inviting a friend over to listen, but my schedule and his never matched. He worked early and could not stay that late. Another friend said I should ignore it, but I could not. The sound was too clear. I knew it would come every night. It was never random. Always 3 knocks, always around 1 in the morning. After a few weeks, I was worn out. My eyes had dark circles. I felt jumpy all the time. At night, I would lie there, waiting, my neck stiff, my fists clenched. I tried shining a bright flashlight out the window at exactly 1 in the morning. As soon as I heard the first knock, I aimed the beam downward, side to side, up and around. I expected to see something. A bird, a bat, a piece of debris swinging on a wire, but I saw nothing. I looked at the building across the street. I tried to see if someone might be pointing a laser or tapping from a balcony, but that building's balconies did not line up with my window. There was no one there. The windows across from mine were either dark or had curtains drawn. I thought maybe it was a sound coming from inside the glass, but it sounded too much like a knuckle or a small stone. Not a mechanical tick, but a tap with some force behind it. I tried wearing earplugs one night. I still heard it. It was faint but present. It made me jerk awake. I almost tore the earplugs out and ran to the window, same as before. I tried sleeping on the couch in the living room, leaving the bedroom door shut. At around 1 in the morning, I thought I heard something faint through the wall. I walked back in, opened the door, and stood in the bedroom in the dark. I stayed there until 2 in the morning, waiting, but I heard nothing more that night. The next night, I tried the same thing. This time, I woke up on the couch a bit after 1. I rushed into the room and felt like I had just missed it. The tension got worse. I tried talking to the building manager again. He said I might be imagining it. I played him the recording. He said it could be anything. Maybe a neighbor tapping on their own window, and the sound carried somehow. But I knew the difference. The sound came from my window. I could feel the vibration in the glass. I knew that feeling. It was subtle but real. The manager offered to come up one night, but he never actually showed up when I asked him. He was always busy or forgot. I gave up on that. I tried leaving the lights on all night. That did not stop it. I tried keeping the window open. That night, I left it open a crack. At 1 in the morning, I heard 3 knocks. But if the window was open, how could anything knock on the glass? I jumped up and checked. The window was open just a few inches. The knocks sounded the same, like something hitting the glass pane itself. Was it on the outside frame? I stuck my hand out and felt around, but the surface was smooth. No loose parts. I closed the window and stood there, my back stiff, my jaw tight. Time passed, and the knocking did not stop. I became obsessed. Every night, I tried a different tactic. I set up a camera on my phone, pointed at the window, recording video. I made sure the camera's night mode was on. The next morning, I checked the footage. I could hear the knocks on the audio, but I saw nothing in the video. Just the window and the reflection of my room. No movement outside. No change in the light. Just the sudden sound. I watched the video frame by frame, squinting. Nothing. I tried feeling the inside of the window frame during the knocks. I stayed awake, my hand gently touching the frame, ready to sense any vibration. When the knocks came, I felt the slight tremor. It was definitely the window being struck from the outside. There was no doubt in my mind. But what could reach the outside of a third-floor window every night at the same time, leave no mark, and vanish without a trace? I started to dread the approach of one in the morning. I would get tense, sweat forming under my arms, my heart rate up. I had trouble eating dinner sometimes. The stress of not knowing what was happening made me feel sick. My head would hurt, and I would pace around my apartment, looking out other windows, checking the stairwell, listening at the door to the hallway. Nothing ever seemed out of place, just that single window at that single time. I never found a solution. It kept happening, night after night, always the same. 3 knocks on the glass. I never saw anything. I never caught anyone. The building manager never helped. My neighbors never mentioned anything. I had no logical explanation. I stopped trying to explain it. I just learned to live with it. I would wake up at 1, hear the knocks, check the window, find nothing, and go back to bed. After a few months, it still made me nervous, but I got used to it. It was part of my routine now, as strange as that sounds. Even now, I hear it sometimes. I have tried moving my bed to the other side of the room. I tried using heavier curtains. I tried playing music. None of it stops the knocks. They always come. I have learned not to shout, not to panic, not to waste energy checking every little inch of the window. I just listen to the sound, remind myself I have no control over it, and wait for it to pass. I no longer expect an answer. I no longer try to solve it. I just deal with it. But I remember those first few weeks, how tense I was, how hard I tried to make sense of it. The fear was all in the not knowing, the sweat on my neck, the tight feeling in my stomach, the tired eyes from staying up night after night. The knocks did not hurt me. They never broke the glass or entered my home. They just happened, as if something out there decided to remind me that I did not understand everything around me. It still bothers me, but less now. I live with it. That is all I can say. I had been driving rideshare for about 6 months. Most nights were ordinary. I picked people up, dropped them off, and went on my way. Nothing special. But there was this one ride. It was a Tuesday night, around 10:30. I got a request a few blocks away from a small convenience store. The area was quiet, and I remember the sky looked clear. I could see a few stars, which usually didn't happen much around town. I accepted the ride, followed the GPS directions, and rolled up to the pickup spot. I expected a regular guy heading home, or maybe someone getting off work. Instead, I saw a man standing alone on a dark sidewalk near an old apartment building. He wore a dark jacket, maybe black or navy, and he stood very still. He faced away from the building and looked directly at my car. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just stood there, waiting. I slowed down and pulled over. I lowered the passenger window. He didn't say anything right away. I looked at him closely. His face looked calm, not angry, not happy, just calm. He had short, dark hair, and maybe a light beard. Under a street lamp that barely worked, I could see he looked maybe in his 40s, but it was hard to tell. I told him, "Hey, I'm your driver." He nodded once, opened the back door, and got in behind me. The door closed with a soft click. I waited for him to say something. Nothing. I confirmed the destination on the app. Some address I didn't recognize by name. It looked like a location about 15 minutes away. So I said, "It's about a 15-minute drive, okay?" He said, "Yes." His voice sounded low and even. I didn't smell alcohol, and he didn't seem drunk. He just seemed closed off. I didn't think too much of it. People are quiet sometimes. I started driving. The streets were mostly empty. A few cars passed now and then. Most stores were closed. I heard my engine, the hum of the tires on the asphalt, and the faint buzz of a streetlight here and there. The passenger sat behind me, on the right side. I looked at him in the rearview mirror. He wasn't looking at his phone. not looking out the window, not fidgeting. He just stared straight ahead or maybe at the back of my headrest. It felt odd, but I shrugged it off. I'd had awkward rides before. Sometimes people were just tired or upset or didn't want to talk. We reached an intersection where I had to make a left turn. The traffic light felt like it took forever. While we waited, I tried to break the silence. "So, how's your night going?" He didn't answer for several seconds. Then he said quietly, "It's fine." No change in tone, no details. I nodded to myself and focused on the road. I thought about turning on the radio, but I decided not to. Somehow I felt like it would make things more uncomfortable. As we continued, I noticed that the GPS route was leading us toward an older part of town. The streets were narrower, fewer lights, older buildings. I'd driven through there before, but not often. I knew there were some older homes, some abandoned lots, maybe a church or two. I followed the directions. The man said nothing else. At one point, we passed an old gas station. The sign was broken, and the place looked long closed. There was a payphone outside with the receiver missing. The man in my back seat said nothing. I drove on. 10 minutes passed. We were getting closer to the destination. The app showed a location about half a mile ahead. I slowed down. The streetlights were becoming sparse. The area ahead looked dark, except for a few dim lights near what I assumed were some old public buildings. My headlights illuminated a metal fence and some overgrown trees behind it. As I got closer, I realized what it was. A cemetery. The GPS wanted me to turn into a small street right next to it. I felt a little uneasy, but I didn't want to show it. Some people lived near cemeteries. Maybe he lived in a caretaker's house or something. I made a turn, followed a narrow lane that ran along the fence, and stopped where the GPS instructed. I put the car in park. The spot was next to a large iron gate that stood partially open. Inside, I could see old headstones and a few statues. No lights inside. Just darkness, tall trees, and stone markers. The air felt colder now. I checked the rearview mirror and said, "We're here." I turned my head slightly. "Sir?" He didn't answer. I couldn't see his face clearly from that angle. I reached for my interior light. My hand shook a little. I pressed the switch and a dim light came on. I looked into the back seat. Empty. There was nobody there. The seat was empty. The door closed. The seat belt in the back was still neatly folded as if no one had touched it. I leaned over the front seat and checked the floor. The other seat. Nothing. The doors were all locked from the inside, and none had opened during the ride. I couldn't figure out how he got out. I hadn't heard a door open, no sound, nothing. I felt the hair on my arm stand up. My heart was pounding. I looked outside. The street was empty. I got out of the car to check. I looked to the left, to the right, up and down the street. Nobody. I walked around the car. No sign of him. I walked up to the cemetery gate and looked inside. I saw only the outlines of gravestones and a small path covered in dried leaves. I listened. Nothing. No footsteps, no voices. Just the distant hum of some far-off traffic. I took a step back toward my car and stood there, breathing a little faster than normal. I tried to think rationally. Maybe he was never really there. But that made no sense. I had seen him get in. I had heard the door close. He answered me twice. There was no way I imagined all that. Maybe he slipped out quietly when I wasn't paying attention, but I would have noticed a door opening. The car would have made a beep. Also, I had looked in the rearview mirror several times during the ride. I always saw him sitting there, until now. I looked at the ground near the car doors. The area was covered with small stones and leaves. If he had stepped out, I would have heard something. Plus, I had just arrived. I didn't spend any time looking at my phone or anything else. It would have been impossible for him to get out without me seeing him. I walked a bit farther up the street, about 10 steps just to be sure. The road ended a little ahead, leading only to more darkness. No sidewalks, just dirt patches. I returned to my car, got in, and locked the doors. Inside the car, I sat for a minute. I felt my palms sweating on the steering wheel. I checked the ride history on the app. The ride was logged as completed. The name on the app was just a common first name, something ordinary. No profile picture. I tried to recall the man's face. Plain features, nothing remarkable except that cold stare. I tried to remember if he had moved at all during the ride. He seemed too still. I tried not to think about it too much. I just wanted to leave. But I also felt stuck, staring at that cemetery gate. The gate made a faint creaking sound when a light breeze passed. The sound made me twitch. I turned off the interior light, put the car in drive, and pulled away slowly. As I drove back toward the main road, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see him suddenly appear in the back seat again. Of course he didn't. The back seat remained empty. I turned onto a slightly more lit street and felt my body relax a little. My heart was still beating hard, but not as bad as before. I took a few deep breaths. I wiped my sweaty palms on my jeans. I kept driving, not sure where I was going next. I usually lined up rides or headed toward busier areas of town. This time I just drove aimlessly for a few minutes, trying to calm down. I wondered if I should report something to the company. But what would I say? A passenger vanished from my car? That sounded ridiculous. Maybe I would just forget it. Maybe I would tell myself he was a trick of the light or something. But I knew that wasn't true. I had heard his voice, smelled his jacket's faint odor of tobacco. Eventually, I pulled into a gas station that was still open. I parked under the bright lights near the pumps. There were a couple of other cars fueling up. I felt safer there. I got out, stretched my legs, and walked into the small store attached to the station. The clerk nodded at me. I grabbed a soda from the fridge and paid. I tried to keep my voice steady. Just a normal guy buying a soda. I walked back to my car, leaned against it, and sipped slowly. The cold drink helped. I stood there for a while, just watching the other cars come and go. I thought about the man's voice. It was low and calm. He said, "It's fine," and "yes." Just two short responses. I thought about how he got in. He opened the door normally, got inside, closed it, and sat down. He didn't look nervous or in a hurry. He just sat there. Why request a ride to a cemetery? Why disappear like that? I finished my soda and tossed the can in the trash. I got back into my car. My shift wasn't over, and I still needed the money. I checked the app, saw if there were any new ride requests. None at the moment. I decided to head toward the usual hotspots near downtown. Maybe pick up a bar customer heading home. Something normal to shake this off. As I drove, I kept glancing back at the empty seat. The seat looked the same as always. Dark upholstery, a small crease in the corner. Nothing strange. But I couldn't help imagining the man sitting there again, silent, staring at my headrest. I turned on the radio quietly. Just some music, any station. I needed some noise. I focused on the road, the traffic lights, the signs. Slowly, I started feeling a bit calmer. I took another ride request about 20 minutes later. A middle-aged woman going from a restaurant to her apartment. She chatted about the weather, said she was tired from work. I answered normally, pretended nothing had happened. I dropped her off. The ride felt ordinary, which was good. I kept working for another hour, picked up a couple of people. Nothing weird, but I couldn't get the memory out of my head. The man's face, the quiet ride, the empty cemetery. I avoided driving near that area for the rest of the night. I finished my shift around 2 in the morning and headed home. The city was empty, and my car's engine hummed softly. I parked near my apartment building, got out, and looked around. Everything normal. No one watching. No one waiting. I went inside, turned on the lights, locked the door. In my small living room, everything looked the same as usual. I sat on my couch thinking about it. I felt a dull ache in my shoulders from how tense I had been. I tried to recall every detail. The clothes he wore, dark jacket, pants maybe dark as well, shoes I didn't notice. His face was unremarkable except for his intense stare. He didn't blink much. I realized I never saw him use a phone. Most people check their phones or do something else. He just sat there, staring. I thought about how impossible it seemed. A grown man can't just vanish from a locked car without opening a door or making a sound. Yet he did. I considered that maybe I had spaced out at some point, maybe at a traffic light, and he slipped out. But I would have seen the door open. Also, the ride ended exactly at that cemetery gate. Why there? I got up, took a shower, and tried to sleep. I couldn't sleep right away. I kept seeing his face when I closed my eyes. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off. The next morning, I woke up feeling uneasy, but more distant from the event. In daylight, everything felt less intense. I made coffee, got dressed, and looked at my phone. I reviewed the trip history. It was there, just like any other trip. The fare was minimal, almost nothing. The passenger's name was generic. I checked the pickup address. It was a real address near that old building. I remembered the place. There was nothing unusual about it. I went about my day. I didn't mention it to anyone. People would think I made it up. Or maybe I was too tired. Who would believe that some guy just vanished like that? It sounded like a ghost story, but I didn't believe in that kind of thing. I still don't know what happened. I just know what I saw. I know I felt his presence in the car. I heard his voice. And I saw that the cemetery was the final stop on the GPS. After that, he was gone, and I have no explanation. From that day on, I never drove to that part of town after dark. If I got a request near there, I let it go and waited for the next one. I also avoided picking up anyone who looked like him. If someone stood too still or stared too hard, I moved on. I never told this story to my passengers. I just tried to keep it to myself. But I remember every detail even now. That's all there is. I picked up a man, drove him to a cemetery, and by the time I arrived, he was gone. No door opening, no goodbye, nothing. Just me, sitting there in front of an old gate, feeling my heart pounding and my mind racing. I still can't explain it, and I still don't want to think about it too long. It happened, and I can't change it. So I just move on. I remember the first time I noticed something was off with my reflection. It was about 2 weeks ago, late in the evening. I had just finished brushing my teeth. My bathroom was quiet, and I had the lights on, bright and cold. I leaned forward to spit out the toothpaste and rinse my mouth. When I looked up, I saw my face in the mirror, the same as always. I blinked. I'm sure I blinked first, then I noticed my reflection blinked a moment later, as if there was a tiny delay. I thought maybe I was tired, or maybe I was just imagining things. It was such a slight difference that I shrugged it off. I didn't think about it much at the time, but that was the first sign. The next morning, I went into the bathroom again after waking up. I turned on the light. I felt a bit groggy. I looked into the mirror. My reflection looked normal. I raised my left hand, and my reflection raised its right, as it should. Everything seemed fine. I stepped closer, looking for any detail. I saw my eyes red from lack of sleep. I saw my skin, a bit pale. Everything matched. I turned my head slightly to the left and right. My reflection did the exact same thing at the exact same time. Nothing unusual. I walked out feeling relieved. 2 days later, it happened again. I was standing in front of the mirror in my bedroom. It's a tall mirror leaning against the wall. I usually use it to check my shirt, my pants, or just my overall appearance before I leave the apartment. That day, I was adjusting my collar, and I noticed something strange. I dropped my hands to my sides, but I had the impression that my reflection kept its hands up just a fraction of a second longer. I stared at it. The reflection looked perfectly normal, but I was sure I had noticed a slight delay again. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. Everything moved at the same time. I told myself it was probably just my imagination or a slow response in my tired brain. A few days after that, I was shaving in the bathroom. I had shaving cream on my face. I moved the razor slowly, and I was careful with the angle. I didn't want to cut myself. The mirror was right in front of me. My reflection was there, doing the exact same thing. I cleaned the razor under the running water, then looked up at my reflection. The moment I looked up, I swear I saw my reflection's eyes focused on me. I mean, focused straight into my eyes, not just matching my movement. It felt like it was looking at me first, and then I realized I was looking at it. This time I stopped what I was doing. I stood there, raising my eyebrows, moving my mouth slightly, tilting my head. My reflection did all of it perfectly. But I couldn't shake off the feeling that it was watching me, not just copying me. I was breathing faster now, and my chest felt tight. I turned off the faucet and left the bathroom without finishing my shave. Over the next few days, I tried to ignore it. I tried not to look at mirrors too much, but that's hard to do. They're in the bathroom, in the bedroom, and even some windows at night reflect your image when the lights are on inside. I began to avoid eye contact with my own reflection. Still, sometimes I had to look. I had to wash my face, brush my hair, or just check if there was something stuck in my teeth. And every time I glanced, I noticed tiny, strange details. Once, I raised my hand to scratch my ear. I was pretty sure my reflection took a tiny fraction of a second longer to scratch. Another time, I blinked a few times in quick succession. My reflection missed one of the blinks. It just didn't blink that time. I backed up from the mirror and stood in the hallway, breathing heavily. I thought I was losing my mind. I even rubbed my eyes and counted to 10. Then I went back and looked again. Everything seemed normal again. But it was too late. I knew something was wrong. I started to feel very tense around mirrors. My stomach felt uneasy whenever I got close to one. My hands got sweaty. My heart would beat faster. I tried to act normal, but I couldn't relax. I tried telling myself that mirrors just reflect what's in front of them, and there was nothing else to it. But I knew what I had seen. A week later, something worse happened. I was in the bathroom again, washing my hands. I had just come back from a walk. My shirt was a bit damp with sweat. I had my sleeves rolled up. I turned the faucet off and looked up at the mirror. My reflection was there, looking straight at me. I tried moving my head slightly. The reflection followed perfectly. Then I looked down at the sink. When I looked back up at the mirror, my reflection's eyes were still on me, as if it had never looked away. I stepped back and stared. I moved one hand up, then the other. Everything seemed synchronized again, but I felt that the reflection had been watching me the whole time, even when I wasn't looking. I felt a chill on my skin. I breathed through my mouth and tried not to panic. I decided to test it again. I looked down at my feet for a few seconds. Then I quickly looked up at the mirror. For a brief moment, I caught my reflection's eyes fixed on me before it adjusted to mirror my posture. It was a split second, but enough for me. I knew now that whatever was in that mirror wasn't just copying me. It was aware of me. I felt a deep sense of unease. I walked backward out of the bathroom, keeping my eyes on the reflection. It followed me as expected, but I couldn't trust what I was seeing anymore. That night, I lay in bed staring at the dark ceiling. I had turned off all the lights. I left the bathroom door shut. I didn't want to see my reflection anywhere. I felt a nervous tension in my shoulders and neck. My throat was dry. I kept swallowing. I could hear my pulse in my ears. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that reflection staring at me, waiting for me to look away so it could do something else. After a long time, I managed to sleep, but it was a light, restless sleep. I woke up a few times, sweating and breathing heavily. The next morning, I decided to face it head on. I got up and walked to the bathroom. I stood in front of the mirror. I looked my reflection in the eyes. I said nothing. I just watched. I thought that if it was going to do something strange, I should confront it directly. For a while, everything was normal. I moved my arm up and down. My reflection did the same. I turned my head side to side. It followed. I opened my mouth. It opened its mouth. I did this for maybe 5 minutes. Nothing unusual happened. My back started to ache because I was so tense. Then I tried the trick again. I looked away for a moment, pretending to check something on the counter. I looked back quickly. I swear I saw it happen again. My reflection's eyes were already locked on me before I looked. I felt the hair on my arms stand up. I tensed my jaw. I leaned closer. I wanted to see if there was some delay in my movements. I raised my right hand, slowly, very slowly. The reflection raised its left hand. The timing was perfect. I moved my fingers. It moved its fingers. I tried blinking irregularly. My reflection matched me, blink for blink this time. I exhaled through my nose and stepped closer. I was maybe 6 inches from the mirror now. I could see every pore on my face. I could see my reflection's eyes. They looked just like mine. But they felt alert, more alert than they should be. Suddenly, out of nowhere, my reflection smiled. It was a small, quick smile, like a grin. But I hadn't smiled. My face was neutral, tense, not smiling at all. I took a step back and froze. I felt my heart pounding. My reflection now matched my expression again, neutral and tense. But I had seen it. It had smiled at me. I didn't know what to do. I felt sweat forming on my forehead. My breathing got heavier. I looked away, then back again. It was mirroring me perfectly, except for that brief moment. I stumbled out of the bathroom and closed the door. I pressed my back against the hallway wall. I stared at the closed bathroom door, breathing through my mouth, trying to calm down. I could still picture that grin. It was my own face, but it wasn't me. My chest felt tight. My stomach felt queasy. My hands were shaking. I decided to avoid the bathroom mirror for the entire day. I used my kitchen sink to wash my hands. I avoided looking at the bedroom mirror. I kept the lights dim. I had a small TV and it reflected a bit, but not enough to show my full face. I tried to keep myself busy, doing simple things like washing dishes or straightening up some books on the shelf. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. The smile was quick, but it happened. By late afternoon, I felt that I had to check again. I had to confirm what was happening. I felt dread, but I also felt the need to know. I went back to the bedroom and stood in front of the tall mirror. The light in the room was soft. I could see myself clearly. I wore jeans and a plain t-shirt. I looked normal. I raised my hand. The reflection raised its hand. I turned my head. It turned its head. I did a little jump. It jumped. Everything was perfect. I stared into my reflection's eyes. I waited. I felt my stomach twist. My hands were sweaty again. I waited some more, maybe 2 minutes. Then it happened. The reflection's mouth curled into that small grin, just for a second. I jumped back. I didn't smile. I pressed my lips together. I shook my head and rubbed my eyes. I looked again. It was matching me perfectly now. No grin in sight. I stepped away from the mirror, feeling shaky. I walked around the apartment, checking the windows. At night, with the lights on, I would see my reflection in the windows. I started to feel worried about that. I thought about covering the mirrors. I grabbed a towel and went into the bathroom. I held the towel in front of me and looked at the mirror. My reflection was there, calm, doing what I was doing. I hesitated. Then I quickly covered the mirror with the towel, pressing it against the surface. For a moment, I felt relieved. I couldn't see it anymore. Then I went to the bedroom and took an old bedsheet. I covered the tall mirror as well. I made sure it was fully covered. I felt less tense now. Without seeing my reflection, I could pretend everything was normal. I sat down on my couch and turned on the TV. I kept the volume low. I tried to watch some random show focusing on the voices and the movement on the screen, but my mind kept drifting back to the reflection. I knew it was still there, behind the towel or the bedsheet. I knew that if I uncovered the mirrors, I would see it again, staring at me, maybe smiling again, maybe doing something else next time. I began to notice every shiny surface. The microwave door, the surface of my cell phone's screen when it was turned off, the glass frame of a picture on the wall. Everything could show my reflection if the angle and light were right. I found myself avoiding looking at all these surfaces. I tried to keep my eyes down, focusing on objects that had no reflective properties. That night, I slept with the mirrors covered. I still woke up sweating a few times. I heard the creaking sounds of the apartment's walls. I felt paranoid, like I had to check if the covers had slipped off the mirrors. I got up once and checked. The towel and bedsheet were still in place. I felt a slight sense of relief. The next morning, I decided to see if anything had changed. I removed the towel from the bathroom mirror and stood there, facing my reflection again. It looked normal. I tried looking away, then back again. It matched me perfectly. I waited for a smile. Nothing happened. I tried making a sudden movement, like raising both arms quickly. The reflection matched me. I opened my mouth and closed it. Perfect sync. I looked at my eyes, waiting. After a few minutes, I saw it again. The reflection's lips twitched into that grin for less than a second. I backed up and almost slipped on the bathroom rug. I caught myself on the door frame. My reflection had matched that movement, but I knew what I had seen. That grin didn't come from me. I never moved my mouth that way. The reflection's grin looked deliberate. It looked like it was done on purpose. After seeing that again, I covered the mirror and backed out of the bathroom. I decided I would keep all mirrors and reflective surfaces covered. I searched around the apartment and covered every mirror I found. I even took down some glass picture frames and put them in a closet. I tried to minimize my reflections everywhere. I stopped using the bathroom mirror entirely. I used my phone's front camera to check my appearance. Even then, I turned it on quickly and off again, not looking too long. I lived like that for several days. The tension didn't go away. I kept thinking about that grin. I knew it was there. I knew what I saw. It was real. I have no explanation for it. I have no idea what's going on inside those mirrors. I can only say that something is off. I can't look at my reflection without feeling like I'm being watched. I feel like if I give it too much attention, it might do something worse than smile. I don't know what that could be, and I don't want to find out. Now I'm sitting here, telling this story, with all mirrors covered, hoping that if I ignore my reflection long enough, it will stop acting weird. I can't say things are normal. I feel uneasy all the time, but I'm not going to uncover those mirrors again. I know what I saw. I know my reflection smiled without me smiling. That's enough for me to keep them covered and try to go on with my life. I don't need any more proof. I'm not curious. I'm just tired and nervous. I don't want to see that grin ever again. I'm not entirely sure when I first noticed it. The night air was heavy, clinging to my skin, and I remember standing in the middle of the living room, right below that corner of the ceiling. I'd been unable to sleep again, too warm, too restless. The apartment was quiet, its white walls glowing softly under the dim light of a single lamp in the hallway. I looked up, squinting. There was a dark smudge there, a small patch in the corner, almost hidden where two walls met the ceiling. It shouldn't have been there. I'd painted these walls myself a few months back. Everything was supposed to be pristine. At first, I thought it might be a bit of mold or a stain from some water leak. I stretched on my toes, craning my neck. The texture of the ceiling looked normal. I flicked off the hallway lamp to see if maybe it was just a trick of the light. But even in partial darkness, the spot remained, a shadow without an obvious source. I turned the light back on and tried not to dwell on it, forcing myself to return to bed. But I kept feeling that subtle, nagging unease, like an itch behind my ribs. I'd moved into this apartment a year ago, after leaving a place that never felt like mine. This was supposed to be a fresh start. The building was old but well maintained, and I'd chosen a top-floor unit with high ceilings and large windows. I remember being excited about how bright and open it felt. I needed that sense of openness. I'd been stuck in a cramped studio before, and this place offered relief. Now, lying awake in my bed, I could still sense that dark smudge lurking overhead in the living room. My chest tightened and I took shallow breaths, trying to ignore it. The next morning I examined the spot again. It hadn't changed, or at least not in a way I could easily detect. Maybe I'd been too tired the night before. I tried to brush it off, but there was something unsettling. I dragged a chair under the corner and stood up, reaching out slowly. My fingertips touched only smooth paint. No dampness, no rough patch, no dust. Yet when I stepped back, that dark shape still clung there, hovering like a stain on my mind. Over the following week, I tried to keep busy with work. I'm a freelance designer, so I spend a lot of time at home. Normally, I enjoy the silence, the hum of my laptop, the midday light flooding through the windows, but now every time I got up to stretch my legs, my eyes drifted upward. The spot seemed bigger. Not dramatically so, but bigger. Where it had been just a speck, it now looked like a small splotch about the size of a coin. Its edges were irregular, and when I stared at it too long, it seemed to shift, as if flexing slightly, distorting the smooth ceiling line. I got a step stool and tried wiping it with a damp cloth. The cloth came back clean and the spot did not budge. I noticed that when I stood very still, I couldn't find any obvious source of shadow. No lamp, no beam of sunlight, nothing that should cause that shape. Yet it was there. It was darker than the surrounding ceiling, but it wasn't color. More like a void. Around this time, I started sleeping poorly. Night after night, I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding. Sometimes I thought I heard soft creaking sounds overhead, but the old building was always settling, its beams and pipes murmuring softly. Still, there was an atmosphere now, something pressing down on me, making the air thicker. One afternoon, I decided to explore the apartment more thoroughly, looking for something that might explain the phenomenon. The previous tenant had left a few boxes in the storage closet when I moved in, and I'd never bothered to throw them out. Inside, I found some old magazines, yellowed newspapers, and a small leather-bound notebook with brittle pages. Most of it was garbage, but in the notebook, tucked between pages filled with illegible scribbles, I found a faded black and white photograph. It showed a corner of a room, this very room, I think, though the angle was different. The walls looked paler, emptier. In the photo's upper corner, I could almost make out a dark smudge, eerily similar to mine. The image was blurry, but I couldn't deny it. That shape was there even back then. Goosebumps prickled over my arms. The previous occupant must have noticed it too. That night I turned off all the lights and stood quietly in the middle of the living room, staring upward, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The smudge looked bigger than ever, maybe as wide as my palm. The silence was so intense I swore I could hear my own heartbeat. Then something happened. The spot seemed to ripple as if it were not just a discoloration but some living darkness. My breath caught. I tried to tell myself it was an illusion, my eyes playing tricks, but I felt a tension in my chest, a suffocating pressure that made me gasp for air. I flicked on a lamp, and as light flooded the room, the shape looked still again, inert, but no smaller. My attempts to ignore it failed. Over the next few days, the shadow spread with increasing speed, especially at night. By the time I woke each morning, it seemed to have gained a few millimeters, creeping along the ceiling line and down toward the walls. Its edges twisted into subtle shapes, tentacle-like protrusions maybe, or thin strands that curled along the plaster. I wouldn't say it had a pattern exactly, but it felt deliberate, as if it were slowly taking hold of my safe haven. I decided to call someone for help, but who do you call for a living shadow? An electrician, a painter, a priest? The landlord was out of town. I tried phoning a friend, but I felt stupid explaining this. I ended up saying only that I was feeling unwell, that I needed some company. He said he'd drop by next week. Next week felt like a century away. That evening, I tried to sleep in my bedroom with the door closed. I left the hallway light on, hoping it would somehow keep the darkness at bay. But as I drifted in and out of an uneasy half-sleep, I sensed movement. I got up, heart pounding, opened the bedroom door just a crack, and peered out. The hallway was dim and silent, but I could have sworn the walls were darker now, as if the paint had dulled overnight, as if the shadow were bleeding beyond the living room. My body was slick with sweat, and my throat felt dry. I grabbed a bottle of water from the kitchen, gulping it down too fast. I needed to do something. I needed to confront this thing. So I marched over to the corner with a flashlight and shone the beam directly onto that spot. The light revealed nothing except the slight texture of the plaster. But as I stood there, I felt my legs tremble. There was a presence. No sound, no touch, but a presence so strong it made my stomach knot. My heart hammered, my mouth tasted stale, and the hair on my arms stood on end. The darkness had weight, and I wasn't just seeing it. I was feeling it seep into the room's very air. For days, I tried fighting back in small ways. I covered the corner with sheets of white paper taped to the ceiling. The next morning, I found them curled at the edges, peeled away. I thought about painting over it again, buying a bright lamp to flood the space with light. But I knew it wouldn't help. This wasn't about paint or light. It was something else, something that had been here before me, maybe long before, something that wanted to consume the space I was clinging to. My appetite vanished. I felt nauseous most evenings, and even the simplest meal felt like chewing chalk. The apartment was hot, stifling. I opened the windows wide, tried to air it out. The outside noise of traffic and distant sirens made me feel less alone. But as the sun set, I knew what waited inside. I considered leaving, just running off to a motel. But my finances were tight, and I couldn't bear the thought of surrendering this place without a fight. Besides, some strange, masochistic curiosity kept me here. Maybe if I understood it, I could stop it. One particular night, the tension reached a breaking point. The shadow had spread along nearly half the ceiling, dark tendrils tracing the contours of the room's edges. In the dim glow of my bedside lamp, I could see it shifting, pulsing as if it were breathing. My breathing became shallow, my pulse pounding in my ears. I stepped into the living room, trembling but determined. My voice came out hoarse. "What do you want?" Of course, no answer. Just the silence and that relentless expansion. I remembered the old photograph. I rummaged through the storage closet again, looking for something else, some clue. Shoving aside dusty magazines, I found a folded piece of paper wedged behind a loose board. It was a receipt, decades old, for some home repairs. On the back, someone had written, in shaky handwriting, "It grows when you're afraid." My skin went cold. Whoever lived here before knew this thing. They tried to warn me in their own silent way. A surge of anger rose in my chest. Was this thing feeding on my fear? If that was true, maybe I could fight it. Maybe I could starve it. But I was exhausted, terrified. Fear had become part of me. I could barely hold my flashlight without shaking. I stood facing the corner, arms folded, tears threatening to spill. "You won't have me," I muttered, voice cracking. I turned off every light except one small lamp by the door. I forced myself to stand beneath the dark mass. My heart was racing so fast I felt dizzy. I tried slow breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth. My stomach churned. I looked straight up, forcing myself to see it. The mass trembled, a faint shimmer along its edges. My knees buckled and I had to lean against the wall. My sweat felt icy against my back. Then I did something reckless. I raised my hand and pressed it against the wall just below the shadow's edge. I half expected something to grab my wrist, pull me in. Nothing, just the chalky texture of paint. But I heard a faint creak, felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere like a current of air moving silently overhead. A sudden wave of nausea hit me. I stumbled back, covering my mouth, breathing hard. The ceiling looked almost fully swallowed now, darkness blotting out the white paint. The presence in the room thickened until I felt as though I were wading in invisible tar. My lungs struggled to draw breath. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to flee, but I stayed, sweat trickling down my temples. My vision blurred. I had to make a choice. Leave now or do something drastic. I grabbed a broom handle and jabbed at the ceiling. The tip scraped uselessly at the dark. The handle slipped from my sweaty palms. I cursed under my breath. The darkness quivered. and for a second, I thought I saw a shape, an elongated silhouette, almost like a human form, twisted and wrong. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted for the door, nearly tripping over the rug. Outside, the hallway lights were blinding. I gasped, sucking in air, heart pounding, head throbbing. I paced there for a while, considering just leaving everything behind. But after a few minutes, I pushed myself back into my apartment. I had to know if it followed me outside. Inside, it was quieter. The lamp by the door flickered once and steadied. I looked up. The darkness was still there, but it no longer seemed to spread as quickly. Had it receded a bit, or was that my imagination? I crawled into bed, leaving the door open and the lamp on. Eventually, I slept, though my dreams were filled with shifting shapes and suffocating silence. In the morning, I found the ceiling stained more than ever. Nearly all the upper surface was dark, but something felt different. It had stopped just short of my bedroom doorway, as if uncertain. I ran a hand over my face, feeling stubble and sweat. I felt weaker, jittery, as if my nerves had been fried. Checking my reflection in the bathroom mirror, I noticed something strange. The skin under my eyes looked darker, almost bruised. When I leaned in, I thought I saw a faint shadow flicker across my face, as if the darkness overhead were reflected somehow in my own features. I decided then and there that I'd leave the apartment at dusk and not return. I'd find a cheap hotel, or even sleep in my car if I had to. But as I gathered a few belongings, I felt an odd resistance, as though the air thickened near the door. I forced myself out anyway, and as I stepped into the corridor, I looked back one last time. In the dim light filtering in from the hallway, I could see a twisted shape in the ceiling's darkness, a hollow outline that might have been a face if I dared to look long enough. I slammed the door shut, my heart pounding in my throat. Even now, as I stand here gripping the railing of the old staircase, I can still feel it. The presence is behind that door, clinging to my walls, waiting. I run a hand over my sweaty face and catch my reflection in the shiny metal banister. For just an instant, I see the shadow ripple behind my eyes. I blink and it's gone, but I know it's not finished. That darkness has tasted my fear, and I doubt it will remain confined to just one apartment. It's patient, hungry, and I'm certain that the next time I see my own reflection, I might not be alone in it. I jolted awake, heart pounding as I heard the scrape of a key in the door. It was sometime deep in the night. My phone's screen showed 3:04 a.m. My mouth felt dry as paper, and I could taste old cigarette smoke lingering in the stale air. I was in that run-down motel room on the outskirts of town, the one I'd chosen out of desperation when the house keys no longer fit my own front door. That was 2 nights ago. Now, in this cramped, peeling room, I lay frozen under a thin, scratchy blanket, listening. The door rattled once, then twice. The handle turned, squeaking softly. I had locked it, though, double-locked it, in fact, with the flimsy chain and the old brass bolt. My left hand trembled as I groped for something on the nightstand, a half-empty bottle of water. I clutched it as if it could help. The overhead light was off, but a dim neon glow leaked in from the motel's buzzing sign outside. I could make out the shape of the door, the worn carpet, the hulking wooden dresser with a large mirror propped against it. That mirror always felt out of place, standing tall in the corner, reflecting the room in distorted angles. Even now, half hidden in shadows, it bothered me. I breathed through my nose slowly, trying not to make a sound. My heart thumped hard enough to shake my ribs. The door's handle stopped turning. I waited for something more. Footsteps, a whisper, a silhouette passing by the thin curtains. Nothing. Just a faint hum of distant traffic and the soft pop of the old mini-fridge. After a few minutes, when my chest stopped constricting so tightly, I reached for my phone again. The time was now 3:07 a.m. My throat felt sore. Could I have imagined it? No, I was sure I heard that key. I hadn't slept well since arriving here, but I knew this was real. I pushed myself up, careful not to let the bed's old springs squeal too loudly. The carpet's rough fibers prickled under my bare feet. I approached the door and pressed my ear against the chipped wood. Outside, there was only silence. When I finally flipped on the lamp, its weak yellow glow revealed the door just as I'd left it. Bolt in place, chain latched. I even gave it a little tug to be sure. It held. Confused and uneasy, I turned back to the mirror, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the room's faulty air conditioning. The mirror was large, the frame carved with strange patterns, floral shapes that looked wilted, worn, or maybe even charred. It gave off a subtle odor, a dusty old smell I couldn't quite identify. I'd tried not to look at myself in it too often these past days. The reflection that came back at me always seemed just a fraction too slow, like some cheap camera feed with a slight delay. But now, as I stood there, I noticed something else. The reflection of the door in the mirror. It showed the chain hanging slightly lower than it did in reality. I blinked and leaned in. Maybe it was just a trick of the angle. I ran a hand through my hair, feeling sweat at the nape of my neck, then crawled back into bed and lay awake until dawn, heart thumping softly, waiting for another sound that never came. By morning, a weak light filtered through the stained curtains. I rose, still feeling that prickly tension under my skin. The first thing I did was check the door. To my shock, the bolt I'd locked so carefully last night was drawn back. The chain dangled free. I remembered latching it with a deliberate click, but now it hung open as if no one had ever touched it. I felt a tightness in my stomach, and my hand shook as I tested the door. It opened easily. The hallway outside was empty. The smell of old carpet and spilled beer greeted me. I saw no one. I shut the door and locked it again, this time pressing my shoulder against it to confirm it was secure. I looked around the room, searching for any sign that someone had entered. The chipped dresser drawers, the sagging bed, the battered armchair, and the mirror, standing silent and dusty. Nothing seemed disturbed. I rubbed my eyes, took a few deep breaths, and decided I had to get out of here. But I had no other place to stay, not yet. I'd left my old life behind in a hurry. I had nowhere else to go until I got my situation sorted out. The motel had been cheap and didn't ask questions. That was its only virtue. I tried calling the front desk, but no one answered. The phone on the bedside table was silent, its cord tangled. I flipped through the old menu and motel guide that lay nearby. Crumpled papers, local advertisements, and a folded newspaper clipping from years ago tumbled out. The clipping caught my eye. It mentioned the motel name and a missing guest. No details, just a brief note. My skin crawled. Was this left by a previous tenant? I examined the date. Older than I could guess, the ink faded. I stuffed it back, not wanting to think about it. Throughout the day, I tried to distract myself. I paced the room, took a shower under lukewarm water, let the old soap's rancid smell wash over me, and tried to focus on practical matters. I inspected the mirror frame closely. The wood was warped, and near the bottom I noticed a small, barely visible scratch mark, like tiny letters etched into the frame. I bent closer, sniffing the dusty surface. It smelled bitter, like old varnish and something else, something organic that made my stomach turn. I couldn't decipher the letters. They looked like half-erased initials or maybe symbols. I tried wiping the mirror's surface with a damp towel, expecting some grime to come off. The cloth came away nearly clean, leaving only my own pale face staring back. My eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep. As evening fell, my nerves settled slightly. I forced myself to eat a protein bar I had in my bag, though it tasted like cardboard. I turned on the TV, flipping channels aimlessly. Static, infomercials, old reruns. The room's hush settled back in. Outside, the neon sign buzzed, and occasionally, a distant car whooshed by. Every so often I glanced at the door, verifying it was still bolted. I even pushed a chair up against it. If someone tried that again, I'd hear them. Midnight crawled in slowly. My eyelids felt heavy, but fear kept me alert. When I finally drifted off, it was to the sound of my own breathing, slow and shallow. Sometime later, I jerked awake. Not from a key this time, but from a soft creak. It might have been the dresser settling or the floorboard shifting. But I was alert instantly, sitting up in bed with sweat trickling down my spine. The lamp was off. I must have dozed off without turning it on. Only the neon haze remained. The mirror caught my eye. There was something odd in its reflection. The shape of the door's chain lock seemed twisted, drawn too tight. I blinked, trying to adjust my eyes. The door itself was still shut, the chain in place, but the mirror showed it differently, like a funhouse distortion. Then I heard a gentle tap, not on the door, but behind me. My blood ran cold. Slowly, I turned my head, every muscle tensed. The dresser. I could swear it came from inside the dresser. I stepped out of bed and approached it, knees weak. My hand trembled as I pulled open the top drawer. Just motel stationery and a musty smell. The second drawer stuck a bit, and when it finally gave, something thin slid behind the dresser and fell to the floor. Kneeling down, I reached for it. A small photograph, black and white, frayed at the edges. It showed a woman standing in front of this very motel room, the same mirror propped up behind her. Her face was partially blurred, her features indistinct. Someone had scrawled something on the back in pencil. Always here. I felt a shiver and put the photo down on the bed. When I looked back at the mirror, my reflection seemed slightly off-kilter. My breathing turned shallow and I tasted acid in my throat. A sudden urge overtook me. I needed to remove that mirror. I couldn't stand it another second. I pushed the dresser aside and tried to lift the mirror off the wall. It wasn't hung, just propped, but it weighed a ton. My muscles strained, my palms sweating. The mirror barely budged. I slid my hand around its edge, feeling splinters prick my fingertips. Frustrated and desperate, I grabbed a motel towel and threw it over the top half of the mirror. It covered some of my reflection, at least. Feeling slightly calmer, I let out a shaky breath and stepped back. The moment I turned toward the bed, I heard the doorknob click. Terror jolted me like an electric shock. I rushed forward, pushing my shoulder into the door. It was still closed. The chain rattled softly. But as I looked down, I saw the bolt sliding, as if pushed by an invisible hand, pulling itself back with a quiet squeak. My heart hammered. I pressed my hand against the bolt, struggling to keep it in place. It felt slippery, as if it didn't quite fit anymore. My arms shook. I managed to hold it a moment, then I stumbled back, releasing a ragged gasp. A faint laugh, or maybe just my own ragged breathing, echoed in my ears. I turned around to face the mirror. The towel had slipped, revealing my reflection again. And now I realized something horrifying. My reflection's eyes were not aligned with mine. They seemed angled, looking off to the side, as if watching something else in the room. I took a step closer, feeling nauseous. My legs were rubbery, sweat trickled down my temples. The mirror's surface shimmered slightly, a greasy layer of distortion making my reflection's mouth curl into something that wasn't quite a grin. I couldn't stand it. I tried the door's knob again, this time determined to leave no matter what hour it was. The chain came off easily. The bolt, which moments ago had seemed locked in a struggle, now slid aside as if nothing had happened. The door opened onto the same empty hallway, smelling of dust and stale air. I gripped my bag and staggered out, not bothering to pack properly. I just wanted out of that suffocating room, away from that twisted reflection. In the hallway, the lights were dim. I heard no one. I hesitated, forcing myself to glance back. Inside the room, through the half-open door, I caught a final glimpse of the mirror. In that brief, flickering moment of fluorescent light, I swear I saw a shape move behind the glass, an outline that wasn't me. My heart lurched and I yanked the door shut. In the parking lot, the dawn sky was turning gray. My hands shook as I fumbled my car keys. I felt the night's terror lingering under my skin, making it crawl. Even as I sat in the driver's seat, ready to leave that filthy place behind, I sensed something in the corner of my vision. When I pulled down the visor, I caught my face in the small vanity mirror. A chill ran through me. For a split second, my eyes didn't look like my own. Darker, emptier, as if reflecting that old motel room. I slammed the visor up and started the engine. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. And I knew, somehow deep down, that Mirror's presence had clung to me. It lurked beneath my skin, in the corners of my sight, waiting for the right moment to surface. I remember the exact moment the forest went quiet. I was inside my tent, just having zipped it up for the night, when a sudden hush fell over everything outside. Not the usual nighttime stillness. This was absolute silence, as if the wind, the leaves, the insects, and the distant creek had all conspired to hold their breath at once. I had chosen this remote spot to find peace away from the city, thinking a weekend alone beneath towering pines would clear my head. Instead, I felt my heart sink into my stomach. The only sound was my own breathing, too fast and too shallow, pressing against my eardrums. I shifted, my sleeping bag rasping softly against the nylon floor. I tried to tell myself this was normal. Maybe a predator had wandered nearby, causing the smaller creatures to go still. But when I held my breath to listen, I heard nothing. No owl, no rustle of underbrush, nothing. Then came the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps circling my tent. They were too slow to be from a deer and too even to be from a bear. Each thud made the fabric walls tremble. I waited, sweat collecting at the base of my spine. My palms went clammy, and I could feel every hair along my arms standing on end. I reached for the flashlight beside my sleeping bag and clicked it on, but the weak beam inside my tent did nothing to reveal what lurked outside. I tried to speak, but found my throat locked. After a few seconds, I managed a strained whisper. "Hello?" No answer. The steps stopped. My heart pounded harder, and the silence returned. I listened, body rigid, face inches from the thin wall of the tent. Then the steps started again, circling once more, closer now. In a burst of desperation, I unzipped the tent door and shone my flashlight into the darkness. The light fell on mossy trunks, damp ferns, and the faint outline of the old cabin I'd spotted earlier that afternoon, just about 30 feet away. The structure had intrigued me when I first arrived. It looked like it had been abandoned decades ago, with its roof half collapsed and a single dusty window. I hadn't dared to go inside, preferring the comfort of my tent and my own gear. But now, that cabin's silhouette offered a strange sort of refuge. If something was out here, maybe I'd be safer behind wooden walls instead of canvas. Yet I saw no one, just emptiness. But I felt it, an unmistakable presence, heavy like a weight pressing on my lungs. I crawled out, knees damp on the forest floor. My breath puffed out in shallow huffs. The footsteps ceased, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. I kept my flashlight low, not wanting to draw too much attention, as if the beam itself might provoke whatever stalked around me. My camping gear, just a single backpack with clothes, a bottle of water, a small knife, was quickly gathered. I moved quietly, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. Still no movement, no sound. I forced myself toward the cabin. The trail was barely visible, just a faint clearing in the brush. When I reached the door, the wood felt cold and damp. I pressed the latch. It gave with a squeal that seemed painfully loud in the night air. Inside, the air was stale and smelled faintly of rot and old leaves. My flashlight's beam danced over a rough wooden table, a couple of broken chairs, and a large mirror leaning against the far wall. A mirror. That was unexpected out here, in the middle of nowhere. Its frame was ornate, carved with twisting shapes that looked like branches or vines, maybe. The glass itself was murky, dotted with tiny black specks of age. I pushed a chair aside and closed the door behind me. My heart still hammered, but at least I had something solid at my back now. I slid down against the wall and tried to calm myself. breathing slowly and quietly. My plan had been to spend 2 nights out here. It was supposed to clear my mind of the stress back home. After losing my job and fighting constantly with my girlfriend about money, this solo escape felt necessary. I thought isolation would help me think clearly, remind me what mattered. Now I'd give anything to hear her voice through a phone or see the glow of a neighbor's kitchen light. I felt more alone than ever. The silence was still complete. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears and the faint crinkle of my jacket whenever I moved. After some minutes, I decided to check if I could bar the door. I dragged one of the chairs, then a small wooden chest, positioning them in front of it. With the door secure, I turned my attention to the cabin's interior. If I had to spend the night inside, I might as well know what was here. My flashlight played over the walls. They were rough, made of logs fitted together, with a few gaps stuffed with old, crumbling moss. On a shelf, I found a rusted lantern, some brittle rope, and a handful of papers eaten away by dampness. One of the papers had faint handwriting, but most of the ink had run. I could make out only a few words. Mirror, not safe, and something like only reflection. It sent a chill through me. What was not safe? The mirror? I glanced at it again, and this time the knot in my stomach tightened. The frame's carvings looked more intricate from up close, patterns that suggested snarling faces if I stared too long. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself toward it. I raised the flashlight to the mirror's surface. In the dim beam, my reflection looked off. The angle, the murkiness, maybe that was it, but my shoulders seemed narrower, my eyes sunken. I tried wiping the glass, and as my fingers brushed the surface, a static-like tingle ran through my hand. I jerked back and stumbled. A faint creaking outside made me stiffen. I killed the flashlight and waited, pressed against the cabin wall. My breaths were shallow again. I caught myself trembling as if my body had decided fear was the only rational response now. After long moments, no other sound came. I tried the flashlight again. The mirror's reflection this time showed something behind me. A shape, barely discernible, standing in the corner. I spun around, light sweeping the area. Nothing. The corner was empty. My head throbbed. Was I losing it? Stress could do strange things to a person. I'd been so sure I saw something. Maybe it was a trick of the old glass or my nerves. Still, I felt watched. Every cell in my body screamed that I wasn't alone here. I moved away from the mirror and checked the single dusty window. Through it, I saw only darkness and a faint outline of trees. Suddenly, there was a soft thud against the cabin wall, as if someone pressed a shoulder or a hand against it. I froze, flashlight trembling in my grip. Another thud, then silence. My throat tightened. In a surge of desperate courage, I struck a match from my emergency kit and lit the old lantern I'd found. It burned weakly, casting a dim, flickering glow across the room. I hoped firelight would offer some comfort, but the shadows it created only seemed to twist around the mirror's frame, making the carvings look almost alive. I tried to rest. I settled in the corner opposite the door, lantern at my feet. For a while, nothing happened. I almost thought I could sleep, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. I glanced at my watch. Midnight had come and gone. I had to get out of here at first light. But how to last until then? I reached for the papers again. Maybe they held a clue. Most were too damaged, but I found a scrap that mentioned reflected footsteps and when forest falls silent. It was barely legible, but the fragment suggested that whoever once lived here knew about this phenomenon. Something about the forest going silent meant something else was near. That something might have a connection to the mirror. The words, "No escape through the eyes of the mirror," were scrawled faintly, making no sense to me. My pulse quickened. I wondered if the mirror was some kind of trap, a door, or a lure. Each time I looked at it, I felt a pull, as if I should step closer, peer deeper into that tarnished surface. Without warning, the footsteps returned, this time right outside the cabin door. A slow, scraping step, then another. My chest tightened. I clenched my flashlight and my small knife. I could hear my breath coming too loud, and I forced myself to stay quiet. The lantern's flame flickered, and the mirror's reflection caught my eye again. In the glass, I saw the door slowly open. But when I looked at the actual door, it stayed shut and blocked by the chair and chest. I looked back at the mirror. In it, the door was wide open, a tall shape looming in the threshold, its form impossible to make out. My heart hammered. I smelled something metallic, like old blood or rust. Tears welled in my eyes. This couldn't be real. I looked at my own reflection. I appeared pale, sweat trickling down my temple. But behind my reflection's shoulder, I saw a long hand, gray and skeletal, reaching toward me from the shadowy corner. I whipped around, brandishing my knife at empty air. Again, nothing was actually there. My stomach lurched, and I felt dizzy. This mirror wasn't showing reality as it was. It was mixing something else into the reflection. Memories, ghosts, creatures that existed only in some twisted dimension. I didn't know. But I understood that the fear I felt was exactly what it wanted. The silence outside, the heavy footsteps. Perhaps they were drawn to the mirror's presence or generated by it. I had no phone signal, no one to call for help. My only chance was daylight. If I survived until dawn, I could run. Time crawled. I tried to ignore the mirror, focusing on the door, the sound of my own breathing. But inevitably, my eyes drifted back. Now I saw my reflection smiling when I was not. My heart nearly stopped. My reflection's lips curled upward, baring teeth. My actual mouth was clamped shut in terror. I watched as my reflection's eyes shifted to look at something behind me again. I refused to turn this time, beads of sweat rolling down my neck. The lantern sputtered. I smelled that metallic odor growing stronger. I tasted fear as a dryness in my throat. With a sudden surge of panic, I decided I had to cover the mirror. It was controlling the atmosphere, maybe fueling whatever horror lurked outside. I grabbed the old cloth sack I'd found near the chest and approached the mirror. Every step felt heavier, as if my legs were wading through thick mud. The reflection warped, showing me with twisted limbs. I forced myself forward. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. I lifted the cloth and threw it over the mirror's frame. The instant I did, I heard a shriek outside, soft and distant but unmistakable. Then silence returned, even heavier than before. I stood there, knife in hand, waiting for something to happen. Minutes passed. The lantern's flame settled into a calm flicker. Slowly, I backed away from the covered mirror and settled again near the door. My limbs shook, and I tasted salty sweat on my lip. I had faced it, if not defeated it. At least I had resisted its power to show me those awful images. Dawn came slowly, a gradual lifting of the darkness pressing against the window. By the faint gray light, I unblocked the door. Before leaving, I took one last look at the mirror, still covered. As I stepped onto the forest floor, I saw my reflection in a puddle outside. For a split second, my face in that water looked wrong again, the eyes too hollow. I blinked, and it was gone. I heard distant bird calls. Nature had resumed its normal tune, but my mind felt scarred, raw from terror. I hiked out as quickly as I could, refusing to look back at the cabin. Hours later, safely in my car, I realized my skin felt clammy, my reflection in the rearview mirror unusually pale. I stared at myself, heart still uneasy. I swear, just before I turned the ignition, I caught a flicker of movement behind my shoulder in that tiny mirror. My reflection's lips parted slightly, as if about to speak or grin. I started the engine and drove, feeling that no matter how far I went, something had followed, lurking now not just in the forest, but in any reflective surface I dared to look into. I first noticed it on my second night, just past midnight. I'd gotten up for a glass of water, the floorboards under my bare feet creaking and groaning like old knees. There was that smell again, musty plaster and old wood. something damp lingering in the corners of this apartment. My throat felt dry and my nerves were still raw from the move. I flicked on the dim hallway light, just enough to see without squinting. That's when I saw it in the mirror. The hallway mirror was tall and slender, set into the wall opposite the bathroom door. It had a tarnished frame, ornate patterns, curling leaves, and small bird shapes chipped at the edges. The glass itself was clean, but somehow old-looking. A trick of the light, maybe. Standing there in my rumpled t-shirt and sweatpants, I noticed my reflection didn't look right. I looked smaller somehow. And behind me, in the faint glow, I thought I saw a shape. A figure. I spun around, heart pounding, my breath stuck halfway up my throat. Nothing. Just the empty hallway leading to my bedroom. The silence weighed in my ears. I turned back, leaning closer to the mirror. My reflection looked normal enough now. No figure, no shape behind me. I swallowed, trying to steady my breathing, and decided I was just jumpy. Stress and lack of sleep could explain a lot. After all, moving into this old apartment had been a desperate choice, a cheap rental in an even cheaper part of town, after I lost that last gig. Money was tight, and I told myself I could make it work. But something about this place felt off from the start. The neighbors rarely spoke. The windows rattled in the night wind, and there was that damn mirror, just built into the wall, impossible to remove. The landlord had shrugged when I asked about it. Back in bed, I tried to sleep, but I kept picturing that moment. I tried to visualize what I'd seen, some vague outline behind me, unmoving. It could have been a coat on a hanger, something my mind twisted into a human form. Eventually, I drifted off. The next day passed quietly enough. I unpacked some more boxes, hanging shirts in the closet, placing old family photos on the dusty shelves. I tried to focus on normal tasks, sorting my kitchenware, checking the plumbing, figuring out how to arrange my few pieces of furniture. But the apartment was stubbornly silent. No hum of distant traffic, no music from neighbors. Just thick, muffled quiet. By evening, I'd lit a single lamp in the living room and tried to read, forcing my mind elsewhere. My eyes kept drifting to the hallway, though I couldn't see the mirror from there. The memory lingered like an itch. I decided before going to bed to give that mirror a second look. This time I flicked the light on bright. The bulb buzzed overhead. I approached slowly, my stomach tense. At first glance, nothing. Just me, tired eyes and unshaven jaw, staring back. I reached out, touching the frame. The wood felt cool, smooth in some places and rough where the carving had chipped. I pressed against the glass lightly. Solid. When I stepped back, the hallway behind me was empty. No shape. Satisfied, I turned the lights off and went to bed. Yet something woke me again, maybe around 1 in the morning. The temperature seemed to drop. I could feel a chill creeping up my arms. The old floorboards groaned again as I stepped into the hallway, heart already racing without knowing why. I didn't turn on the light this time. I just looked at the mirror, illuminated only by the faint glow from the street outside. I saw the figure clearly this time. It stood behind me, about an arm's length away in the reflection. A slender silhouette, taller than me, with shoulders that seemed slightly crooked. I held my breath. My reflection was still there in front, pale-faced, eyes wide with fear. But in the glass, that thing loomed behind me, head tilted as if studying me. I felt goosebumps on my arms, sweat gathering at the back of my neck. I forced myself to turn around. Darkness. Empty corridor. Back to the mirror. The figure was still there behind my reflection. Now I could see more details. Sunken eye sockets, skin drawn tight over bony features, and a hint of a twisted smile. It didn't move, but somehow its presence filled my lungs with cold dread. I leaned in slowly, watching for any shift in the reflection. My throat tightened. Suddenly, my own image flickered. The figure's grin seemed to widen, though no sound emerged. I slammed the hallway light on. The reflection returned to normal. Only me. scared out of my mind. No intruder behind me. My pulse thundered. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I made an attempt to be rational. Mirrors can play tricks in low light. Maybe I was seeing some leftover stain or pattern in the glass. I even considered covering the mirror with a sheet, but it was built so snugly into the wall that I'd need tape or nails to fix anything in place. I paced the apartment, looking for tools. I found an old stiff roll of duct tape in a kitchen drawer and an old bedsheet. I tried to secure the sheet over the mirror, but the tape barely stuck to the carved frame. Eventually, I managed a shaky covering, the sheet hanging unevenly. I told myself this would help me sleep. That afternoon, while I was clearing out a corner cupboard, I found something peculiar. A set of old letters stuffed behind a loose board. They were brittle, brown-edged papers that smelled faintly of mold. Each was addressed to a previous tenant, someone named C. Norris. The handwriting was spidery. The ink faded. I glanced through them, making out only a few phrases. The mirror you insisted on keeping, unsettling presence, can't stay here any longer. My mouth went dry. I looked toward the hallway. The sheet still hung over the glass, silent and still. But something about these letters made my fingertips go numb. Night came too soon. I fought sleep, dozing on the couch with the TV on low volume. Around midnight, the power flickered. The room dipped into darkness, the TV silencing itself mid-sentence. The air felt stale. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and panicked. I flicked my phone's flashlight on and aimed it down the hallway. The sheet over the mirror looked distorted in the light, as if something pressed against it from behind. I stood up slowly. My joints felt stiff. The world narrowed to that one spot. As I approached, I heard a faint sound like a soft tap, tap, tap. I paused, my heart hammering, and reached out. The second my fingers brushed the sheet, it fell away, as if yanked downward. In the mirror's dim reflection, I saw myself holding the phone's light, and behind me, the figure. Only now it wasn't just standing there. Its eyes, empty pits, were locked on me. Its lips parted slightly, in a silent attempt to speak or grin. I nearly screamed, stumbling back, my phone flashlight shaking. Still, I forced myself to turn around. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Back in the reflection, though, the figure's arms rose. It made no sound, but I could see it miming some action. Its hands curled into the air as if grasping an invisible handle. Then it pointed at my reflection and tapped what looked like the inside of the glass. I could swear I heard a faint scratching noise, too soft to be sure. Nausea churned in my stomach. I wanted to run out of this apartment, slam the door, and never return. But I didn't have the savings for that. I couldn't afford another move. And there was something else, some horrid fascination rooting me to the spot. I had to know what this thing was, why it was here. I spent the next day trying to uncover more about the apartment. The landlord wasn't helpful, just shrugged on the phone and said the building was old, full of junk. There was no record online of who lived here before me. The letters mentioned a mirror, unsettling presence. Maybe that tenant had experienced the same terror. Maybe he, or she, never left. As night approached, I prepared. I pushed a heavy armchair into the hallway, placing it in front of the mirror. I wanted to see if the reflection would show the figure moving around it. Anything to break the pattern. The hours ticked by. Midnight again. My head throbbed from lack of sleep. My mouth tasted of stale coffee. I stood before the mirror, the hallway light off, only my phone's glow illuminating the space. My reflection stared back, tense, circles under the eyes. Behind me, the figure was clearer than ever. I could make out thin, parchment-like skin, lips drawn tight and eyes like deep holes. It didn't flicker or fade this time. It gestured again, slowly raising one hand and touching the inside of the mirror's surface as if it were a window. My gut twisted. I reached forward and touched the glass. It felt solid, cold. Suddenly, the figure's hand aligned exactly with mine in the reflection. I jerked my hand back. It smiled that crooked, silent smile, then tilted its head as if disappointed. I turned around, desperate to catch it off guard. Nothing. Emptiness. I spun back. Now, the figure pressed its face closer, its mouth moving silently. I could almost read its lips, but I refused to think about what message it might be forming. My body shook. The air turned colder. My mind screamed that this thing wanted to switch places, that it wanted me on its side of the glass. Bile rose in my throat. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the nearest heavy object, an old lamp from a side table, and swung it at the mirror. A sharp crack rang out. Shards of glass scattered into the hallway. The frame splintered. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. When the dust settled, I looked down at the broken pieces. My reflection was now fragmented into dozens of small shards. Among them, I half expected to see that figure's face, but I only saw myself, distorted, shaken. I tried to gather my thoughts. I had to leave. I had to get out of here. But as I turned, I noticed something strange. One piece of the mirror, the largest shard, still reflected the figure's eyes. Just the eyes, black and hollow, staring back at me. I kicked it away, terrified, my stomach knotting. No sound came from it, but I could feel a silent fury humming in my ears. Morning light found me on the sofa, wrapped in blankets, half delirious. I managed to doze off, but nightmares swarmed my sleep. When I woke, I swept the shattered mirror pieces into a box, not daring to look at them too closely. My chest felt tight, as if I'd inhaled cold smoke. I needed to get rid of that glass. But the thought of leaving it behind, dumping it somewhere, felt wrong, as if I'd just passed this horror on to someone else. Instead, I stuck the box in a far corner of the closet, behind winter coats and suitcases. Out of sight, at least for now. I tried to move on, but each time I caught my reflection in any shiny surface, the toaster, the window pane at dusk, I thought I glimpsed something behind me. My neck prickled. My breathing turned shallow. I knew it was gone. I'd destroyed its home. Yet I felt no relief. Only a creeping suspicion that I'd carried something with me, that in some way it was still watching. My skin felt different, colder. My eyes looked darker in the bathroom mirror that morning. Or maybe I was just imagining things. Late that afternoon, I paused in front of a small mirrored picture frame on my desk, the only reflective thing I dared keep uncovered. There, for just a split second, I thought I saw a faint outline, a shape behind me. I blinked and it was gone, but the feeling remained. That hollow presence, hungry and patient, lingering in the corners of my vision. I didn't run. I stayed, too broke and too stubborn to leave, and yet never comfortable again. Every reflection felt like an invitation. Every night brought a whispering chill in the hallway. I can still feel that figure's eyes, even now behind my back, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. It's never really left, I think. The apartment's old secrets cling to me, reflected in every shard of memory I carry. And I know deep inside, the mirror's hold is not broken. It has only shifted. Now it lives behind my eyes, waiting to show itself again. I'm not sure when I first noticed the changes in the painting. I had hung it up in my hallway about 6 months ago. I bought it from a yard sale in my neighborhood. It showed a calm scene with grass, trees, and a few distant hills. There was a fence, some flowers, and a small pond. I remember feeling that it filled the blank space on that wall. At first it seemed harmless. It looked old and a bit faded, but it had a nice frame and the colors seemed calm. I never paid much attention to it after the first week or two. It just sat there every day on that stretch of wall between my bedroom and the bathroom. About a month ago, I was walking past it in the morning and I stopped. I realized the cluster of trees on the left side looked different. They had seemed closer to the fence line before. Now they looked a bit farther away. I thought maybe I had just never examined it that closely. I tried to remember the old positions of those trees, but I couldn't be sure. The paint was cracked in some areas, and there were thin lines running through the sky. I guess that maybe something about the way the cracks caught the light made the trees look a bit off. I shrugged and went on with my day. A few days later, I noticed that the clouds in the painting seemed darker than before. They looked more like storm clouds. I didn't remember storm clouds. I remembered a light, pleasant sky with soft shades of blue. I stood there for a while, leaning in, trying to see if I had missed this detail. The paint had texture. I could see the brush strokes on the clouds. They looked rough, uneven. I reached out and tapped the frame with my fingertip. It felt solid, old wood. The canvas looked normal enough. Nothing moved while I watched. I told myself I must have been mistaken. I had too much on my mind, and maybe I was just noticing details that were always there. Over the following week, I stopped several more times to look closely at that painting. Each time, I found something else that bothered me. The grass looked shorter one day, then taller the next. The flowers changed color. The fence looked broken in one corner. I remember feeling a small knot in my stomach each time I noticed something new. My breathing got tight and I felt a slight pressure in my chest. I would run my hand through my hair and step back. I would blink hard and look again. It never changed while I watched. It always looked still and silent. Yet, day by day, these small differences piled up. My throat got dry when I walked past it. I tried to ignore it, but it was right there in my hallway. I couldn't avoid it forever. When I went to the bathroom or my bedroom, it was there. One morning I saw something that made me sweat. There was a dark shape in the tree line. It hadn't been there before. It was a rough human shape, like a person standing far behind the trees. It was small and vague, just a figure among the trunks. I leaned in close, squinting, holding my breath. It looked like a shadow painted into the scene. It had no clear face, no clear clothing. It was just a darker patch of paint shaped vaguely like a person. My palms felt damp. My heart beat faster. I tried to remember if I had ever seen that figure before. I hadn't. I felt a chill run down my arms. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I just never noticed. But deep down, I knew I had stared at those trees so many times. I would have noticed a figure before. Over the next few nights, I caught myself pausing in the hallway with the lights off. The painting was on the wall and I could barely see it in the darkness. I reached for the light switch. I didn't want to look in the dark. I felt stupid standing there, acting scared of a piece of art. But I felt tense. My shoulders felt stiff. I turned on the hallway light. The painting looked normal at first, but then I saw the figure again. It seemed a bit closer to the edge of the trees. I narrowed my eyes. It was definitely closer. Its shape was clearer. It looked like a tall figure with long arms, maybe. The features were still hard to see. My stomach churned. I took a step back and went straight to my bedroom. I shut the door behind me and stood there listening. I heard nothing. The changes kept happening. Each day I noticed the figure had moved closer to the foreground. The sky got darker. The trees leaned in ways that made no sense. The fence looked broken in several places. The grass looked trampled. The flowers were wilted. I tried to find a rational explanation. Maybe the painting was always this detailed and I just kept missing things. Maybe the light in the hallway changed with the seasons. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. I tried to dismiss it. But at night, when I turned off the lights, I started to hear things. I would hear soft clicking sounds like wood expanding. Then I heard faint sighs. They were short, quiet, and came from the direction of the painting. I stood still in the hallway holding my breath, trying to pick up more sounds. The sounds were there, faint but real. My arms tensed. The hair on my neck stood up. I reached out and touched the frame. It felt slightly cool. I pressed my ear close to it. I heard a soft creaking noise. It reminded me of paint scraping against something. My throat felt tight. I turned the lights back on and looked closely. The painting looked the same as it had earlier that evening. The figure in the painting was almost at the fence line now. It stood clear enough that I could see dark, hollow shapes where eyes might be. Its head was tilted, as if it was looking at something outside the frame. It seemed to face me. I jumped back, my heart pounding, and went to the living room. I sat on the couch trying to calm down. The next day, I decided to remove the painting. I had had enough. I grabbed it by the top of the frame and tried to lift it off the wall. It didn't budge. I pulled harder. It felt stuck. I checked the back. I had hung it on a single nail, but now it felt as if the frame was glued. I pushed and pulled. The frame creaked. The painting's surface seemed to shift under the glass, but I couldn't get it off the wall. I tried prying it with a flathead screwdriver. The screwdriver's tip chipped the plaster, but the frame stayed put. I felt sweat on my forehead. My jaw tightened. I tried one more time, putting all my weight into it. The frame groaned, but it stayed in place. I could feel my muscles ache. I gave up. My breathing was heavy. I decided to leave it for now. That night, I turned off the hallway lights and listened. I tried to stand completely still. I heard a light tapping sound. It sounded like something hitting wood inside the frame. Then I heard a soft, moist sound, like something sliding. I reached for the switch and turned the light on. The painting's surface looked shiny like wet paint. I leaned in. The figure was now standing right behind the fence in the painting. The fence boards looked splintered. The figure's shape was taller and thinner than before. The sky was nearly black. The grass looked flattened. I moved my face closer, just a few inches away. I saw tiny drops of moisture on the painted fence. I touched the glass, expecting it to be smooth and hard. My fingertip felt damp. It smelled like old paint. My stomach turned and I jerked my hand back. My heart was beating fast. I wiped my hand on my jeans and went straight to my bedroom, locking the door. I didn't sleep well. I woke up twice, thinking I heard footsteps in the hallway. I got out of bed and listened at the door. I heard a crackling sound. I opened the door quickly and flipped on the light. Everything was still. The painting was there, unchanged from earlier. The figure stared straight ahead. Its eyes looked like dark pits of paint. I closed the door again and sat on my bed. I didn't turn off the bedroom light. I just sat there, feeling tense, until morning light came through the window. The next morning, I tried calling a friend to help me remove the painting. He said he was busy. I tried calling another friend, but he didn't pick up. I stood in front of the painting, arms crossed, just staring at it. It looked worse. The scene was almost completely dark now. The trees were twisted. The fence looked half gone. The grass was patchy. The figure stood right at the forefront. I could see what looked like hands gripping the fence post. The knuckles were dark lumps of paint. The head was angled downward, as if it was pushing against something. I reached out and tapped the glass again. I heard a faint echo, like tapping a thin sheet of something hollow. I got a damp cloth and tried to rub the frame, hoping maybe I could loosen it. The wood felt rough. Splinters stuck to the cloth. I pulled my hand back and saw small scratches on my palm. My hand stung. I pressed my lips together and tried not to panic. I decided to try something else. I got a hammer from the garage. I tapped the frame lightly, trying to find a weak spot. The frame felt solid. I tried hitting it harder. The hammer bounced slightly, leaving no mark. I struck the glass. The glass did not crack. I struck it harder. Nothing happened. My arm shook. I tried again, hitting the corner of the frame with more force. The hammer made a dull thud. The painting didn't move. I was breathing fast, my chest hurting. I stopped and leaned against the opposite wall. I thought about leaving the house and never coming back. But my keys, my wallet, everything was here. This was my home. I stood there, gripping the hammer, unsure what to do. My mouth felt dry. That night, I left all the lights on in the house. I even turned on the bathroom light. I turned on the kitchen light. The hallway was bright. I watched the painting carefully from the living room. I sat on a chair that let me see the painting at an angle. The figure looked like it was leaning forward, pressing against the inside of the painting's surface. I could see the paint bulge slightly. I stood up and approached it slowly, my sneakers squeaking on the floor. I felt my legs tremble. My hand shook. I reached out and touched the glass. The surface felt soft, like gel. I pulled my finger back quickly. My heart raced. There was a faint chemical smell in the air, like wet paint. I coughed and took a step back, bumping into a small table behind me. I heard a click. The lights flickered. I looked up at the ceiling fixture. The bulb dimmed and then stayed on. I looked back at the painting. The figure pressed its dark shape against the inside surface. I could see the fence posts bending. I saw the figure's arm push forward, stretching the painted surface outward. I heard a wet, sucking sound. My throat tightened. My muscles tensed. I took a few steps back. I felt sweat roll down my neck. I wanted to run, but my legs felt heavy. I decided to leave the house for a while. I went to the front door and opened it. I stepped outside, locking the door behind me. I stood on the porch, breathing the cool night air. I could still smell that paint smell on my clothes. I wiped my face with my sleeve. My head felt light. I stayed there for an hour, just waiting. I tried to calm down. I tried not to think about what I saw. After a while, I decided to go back inside. I had nowhere else to sleep. When I walked back in, I heard a soft scraping sound coming from the hallway. It sounded like something sliding along wood. I turned the corner and saw the painting was slightly angled now. It wasn't flush with the wall anymore. The bottom edge stuck out a bit. I approached slowly. The glass surface looked distorted, like melted plastic. The figure inside looked like it was halfway out of the painting. I could see a dark shape pushing its head and shoulders through the surface. The paint dripped onto the floor in thin droplets of dark fluid. They smelled like turpentine. I froze, holding my breath. I heard a low wheezing sound. The figure's head moved slightly. It had no clear face, just a dark shape with bumps where features should be. Its shoulders were wide and uneven. It wore something dark, but I couldn't tell what. I backed away, almost tripping over my own feet. I tried the light switch again, pressing it off and on. The light stayed on, but it flickered. The figure slid further out. I could see its arm now, bent at an unnatural angle, fingers dripping paint onto the floor. The corridor smelled strong, like fresh paint thinner. I coughed and covered my nose with my hand. My eyes watered. I backed up until I hit the wall. I didn't know what to do. I gripped the hammer again, but my hands shook so badly I almost dropped it. I took a step forward, raising the hammer, but the figure kept emerging. It made a soft cracking sound as it pulled itself free. I couldn't take it anymore. I rushed into the living room and grabbed a blanket, then rushed back and threw it over the painting. The blanket slid off immediately, landing on the floor. I tried not to look at the figure, but I could hear it moving. It made squishing sounds. I stepped away and backed toward my bedroom. It was between me and the bathroom. I had no clear path, but back up into my bedroom. I backed into my bedroom, keeping my eyes on the hallway. I closed the door, but did not lock it. I didn't want to trap myself. I stood there, breathing hard, listening. The hallway was quiet. After a few minutes, I heard a soft rustling sound. I heard the faint creak of floorboards. My heart pounded. My legs felt weak. I wanted to run out the front door, but that meant going past the hallway. I waited, listening. The smell of paint drifted into my room even with the door closed. It made me feel lightheaded. I decided I had to leave. I grabbed my keys and wallet from the nightstand. I took a deep breath and pulled the door open. The hallway was dimmer. The light fixture flickered. The painting was empty. The frame hung there, now looking warped and twisted. The canvas inside was dark and dripping. The figure was gone. I heard a scraping sound from the living room. I rushed forward, not looking around. I ran straight to the front door, my sneakers slipping on the floor. My breathing was fast and shallow. I reached the front door and pulled it open. I stepped outside and slammed it shut behind me. I stood on my porch looking back at my closed front door. The night air felt cold. I heard a muffled sound from inside. like something shifting furniture. I didn't know what else to do. I walked down the steps and headed to my car parked in the driveway. I got in and started the engine. I looked back at the house. The windows were lit. I saw no movement through them. I sat there, engine running, breathing fast. I felt sweat drying on my skin. I didn't know what that thing was, but I wouldn't stay in that house tonight. I backed out of the driveway, gripping the wheel with shaking hands, and I left. I could still smell the paint on my clothes, and my fingertips still felt sticky. I didn't plan to return anytime soon. I remember the first time I noticed it. Late one evening, I stood in my bathroom, looking at the damp spots on the tiles. I had just stepped out of the shower. The overhead light was off, and I had the door half open, letting in a weak glow from the hallway. I saw something odd on the wall above the tub. The moisture had spread out, leaving irregular shapes on the white ceramic surface. At first, I thought it was normal mold, just a patch of brownish stains. But when I leaned closer, I noticed a kind of pattern. The edges curved in a way that looked like a shoulder, maybe a half-formed arm. I squinted. It looked like the outline of a person pressed against the tile, but no one was there. I touched the tile, and it felt cold and slick. The smell of mold was strong, like wet clothes left in a corner for too long. I flipped on the light. The shape became just a patch of moisture. Nothing else. I told myself I was tired and that I needed sleep. I opened the window a crack to let in some fresh air. The night was quiet. I brushed my teeth, kept my eyes on my reflection in the mirror, and then went to bed. I did not think about it until the next night. The following evening, I took a shower around midnight. I had worked late and felt sore. I wanted a hot shower to relax. The water ran down my back, and I closed my eyes, trying to enjoy the warmth. The bathroom light was off again because I liked showering in low light. The hallway lamp gave enough illumination to see basic outlines. As the hot water struck the tile wall, I caught a glimpse of movement. I froze and opened my eyes. On the wall, right in front of me, the moisture formed another strange shape. It was not just a stain. It looked like a part of a face, something around where an eye would be. I saw a darker spot that could have been a hole for a mouth. I felt my shoulders tense. I wiped the water from my eyes and stared. It was still there, half-formed, like someone's face pressing through a wet sheet. The smell of mildew got stronger. My chest felt tight, and I took a deep breath. I reached out with one hand, sliding it along the tile. It was cold and clammy. I flicked on the light. The shape faded and became a plain damp spot. I just stood there, my heart beating fast, water running down my face and neck. I turned off the shower, dried myself quickly, and stepped out. I leaned on the sink and looked at my reflection. I saw my own tired eyes and the beads of water on my skin. I did not see anything else. I left the bathroom door open that night. Over the next several days, I tried to ignore it. I scrubbed the tiles with a sponge, sprayed mold remover, and kept the bathroom fan on after every shower. The smell improved a bit, but after a couple of days, I noticed that when I let the bathroom get humid, the stains started forming shapes again. They never looked perfectly human, but there were angles and curves that hinted at shoulders, chins, and hands. It was never just a random blotch. It always seemed like something trying to resemble a person. Every time I looked too long, I felt uneasy, like I was not alone. My chest would feel heavy, and I would need a moment to calm down. I kept turning on the light to make them vanish, but they always came back when I turned it off. They never appeared in bright light. They preferred the dim glow from the hallway or the early morning light through the small bathroom window. One night, I lay in bed and listened. It was quiet, but I could not sleep. I got up around 3 in the morning and went to the bathroom. I noticed a faint dripping sound. The faucet was off, but a single drop of water fell every few seconds. The sound was soft but steady. I tried to tighten the knob, but it was already as tight as it would go. I stood there for a while, just listening. The smell of mold was back. The tiles on the far side of the tub showed some new shapes. They looked like faces, about 3 or 4 of them, all close together. They were blurry and irregular. Some had what looked like deep-set eyes. Others had flat, broad patches that could have been open mouths. I could almost imagine them whispering or arguing, but there was no sound besides the dripping faucet. My stomach felt uneasy. My throat was dry. I wanted to turn on the light, but I also wanted to see what would happen if I waited. I moved closer, just a step at a time, trying not to make any noise. The odor of mold got stronger. I noticed a slight movement, like the patterns in the moisture were shifting. The shapes seemed to react to the subtle changes in humidity. I could see the edges darkening and lightening as if something ran its hand over them from the other side of the wall. I clenched my jaw. I felt sweat on my forehead. I reached out with my finger and touched the tile. It was wet, and the water running down the surface felt thicker than normal. It was slimy, and I pulled my finger back. I sniffed my fingertip. It smelled like mildew. I felt a small flutter in my stomach, a nervous tension. I flipped the switch. The light blinked on and the shapes vanished. The tiles looked normal again except for the water droplets. I turned off the light and the patterns did not return immediately. I waited a full minute, just watching. Nothing happened. I rinsed my finger under the faucet and went back to bed, frustrated and tired. Over the next few days, I tried a few things. I tried to film it with my phone. I stood outside the bathroom at night, recording while the faucet dripped. I caught the sound, but no clear images. When I watched the footage, I saw only faint shapes and darkness. I tried leaving a lamp on in the bedroom with the bathroom door open, but the shapes only formed when the light was very dim. Whenever I approached with a flashlight or switched on the main light, they disappeared. The smell of mold never left. It lingered, even when I cleaned the tiles. It was not the smell of rotten food or something dead. It was a damp, stale odor, like old towels that never dried properly. I started feeling uneasy all the time. Every time I entered the bathroom, I felt tense. My shoulders hunched up. My neck muscles felt stiff. I had trouble breathing normally in there. When I took a shower, I kept looking at the tiles, expecting something to form. I avoided turning on the overhead light because I wanted to see if it would happen again. Every time, after a few minutes of hot water running, I noticed the moisture patterns returning. They changed position and shape each time, but always suggested human forms. Sometimes I saw something like a head and shoulders. Other times I saw what looked like hands or arms. They never moved fast, but the shapes seemed to shift when I blinked or looked away. I tried talking out loud. One night, as I showered, I said, "I know you're here," in a low voice. I felt ridiculous, but I wanted to see if anything would happen. The smell got stronger, and I noticed a sort of pressure in the water, like something disturbed the shower's spray. The water felt uneven, as if some invisible hand pushed a portion of it aside. I watched the shower curtain move slightly, bulging inward, as if someone were poking it from the other side. I yanked the curtain open, my heart pounding. There was no one there, just the empty bathroom. The drain gurgled. The moisture on the tiles had formed a shape that looked like a half face near the faucet. My chest felt tight. I turned on the light, got out, and dried off quickly. My hands trembled as I put on my clothes. I began to dread going into the bathroom, but I had to shower, had to brush my teeth. Each time I checked the tiles carefully. Sometimes the shapes were faint, just a suggestion of a silhouette. Other times, they were clearer, with shadows that hinted at depth. The smell always returned. The dripping faucet became more frequent and I could not fix it. I replaced the washers, checked the plumbing, but the dripping continued at random times. Each drop sounded too loud in the quiet apartment. Each drop seemed to remind me that I was not alone. One night I tried leaving the bathroom window open wide, hoping the fresh air would dry the place out. It helped a bit, but when I took a shower, the steam still gathered. The shapes reappeared. I tried to clean more aggressively using a bleach solution. I scrubbed until my arms ached, until my eyes watered from the fumes. The mold smell faded for a day or two, but the shapes returned as soon as there was enough humidity. I touched the tile grout and it felt crumbly in some places. Maybe water had seeped behind the tiles. Maybe there was something growing inside the wall. That thought disturbed me. I imagined thick layers of mildew behind the ceramic, forming these patterns as it spread. I swallowed hard and tried not to think about it. I started taking shorter showers. I tried to finish before any shapes could form. I kept the light on most of the time, which seemed to keep them away. But sometimes I would forget to turn it on before entering, and then I would catch a glimpse of something forming on the tiles. Once I saw what looked like 3 faces next to each other, all staring in my direction. Another time I saw a hand shape near the sink. When I ran the tap to wash my face, the hand seemed to shift, its fingers curling slightly. My breath came out fast and I turned the light on. It vanished. I could not explain any of this. I had no reason to believe in anything unusual. I had lived in this apartment for a year without any problems. There was no known history of anything strange here. But now, each night, the bathroom felt like a place I did not recognize. When I stood there, I felt watched. When I showered, I felt surrounded by some silent presence that never fully appeared. It never spoke. It never touched me directly, but I felt its closeness. My shoulders remained tense all the time now. I slept poorly. I woke up sweating, thinking I heard dripping water or the soft sound of the shower curtain moving. I tried ignoring it. I told myself it was just mold and moisture, just a trick of the light. But I could not shake the feeling. My hands shook when I turned the doorknob to enter the bathroom. I tried humming to distract myself. I tried playing music on my phone, but the sound felt hollow in that small space. The water still dripped. The smell still lingered. The shapes still formed. On another night, I decided to confront it more directly. I turned off all the lights in the apartment and waited in the hallway. I stood there looking into the dark bathroom. The streetlight outside cast a faint glow through the small window. The tiles were visible enough. The smell was faint at this time. I waited for about 10 minutes just watching. Eventually, I saw a shape emerging. It started as a dark patch on the lower left tile, then expanded upward. It formed a rough shape that reminded me of a hunched figure. I moved closer, breathing through my nose. My mouth was dry. My heart was beating fast. I reached out and tapped the tile softly with my fingernail. The surface felt slick. The shape shifted slightly, as if disturbed. I pulled back and waited. I heard a soft drip from the faucet. My neck hairs stood up. I felt tension in my jaw. I said, "What do you want?" My voice came out low and a bit shaky. There was no reply, no sound. But I thought I saw the shape tremble as if it tried to become clearer. I saw what might have been a pair of hollow eyes looking at me. I stepped back. My back hit the hallway wall. I reached for the light switch and flicked it on. The shape disappeared. I turned off the light again. The shape did not come back right away. I spent the rest of the night sitting on my couch, staring at my darkened apartment. The bathroom door was closed now. I could still smell a hint of mildew. My stomach felt tight and I could not relax. I rubbed my neck trying to release some tension. It did not help. The next morning, I decided to keep the bathroom door open all day. Lights on, window open. I tried to let it dry out. I placed a small fan on the floor to circulate air. The smell faded a bit. The tiles looked normal in daylight. They were plain white, with a bit of discoloration in the grout. Nothing strange. I wiped them down again with a dry towel and left for work. That evening I came home and approached the bathroom carefully. It smelled cleaner now. I turned off the main light and left only a small lamp on in the hallway. I peeked in. No shapes. I ran the water in the sink for a moment, watching how the moisture behaved. It ran straight down, leaving no odd patterns. I nodded and tried to relax. Maybe it was gone. I decided to take a shower before bed. I stripped down, turned on the hot water, and stepped under the stream. I let the water run over my shoulders. I stayed alert, looking around. At first, everything seemed normal. Then I noticed a slight discoloration at the edge of one tile. It spread slowly, forming a long streak that looked like a thin arm. I felt my muscles tense. The mildew smell returned, faint but present. The shower curtain rustled. I felt a slight tug, as if someone pulled it from the other side. My eyes watered from the humid air. I kept my breathing steady. I reached for the curtain and pulled it open. Nothing there. I looked back at the tile. The shape had formed a blurry face near the arm shape. They seemed connected. I felt my hands shaking, and my chest tightened. I turned on the light quickly, ended my shower, and got out. I dried off and got dressed, avoiding looking at the walls. I knew now that this was not going away. I did not understand it, and I did not know what to do about it. The mold kept trying to form these shapes, these faces and bodies. They never spoke or moved openly, but I felt their presence in the moisture, in the smell, in the odd pressure on the shower curtain, and in the way the faucet dripped at night. I started sleeping with my bedroom door closed and a towel stuffed at the bottom to block any smell. It made me feel a little safer. At this point, I just lived with it. I tried not to think too much. I focused on keeping the bathroom dry, keeping the light on whenever I was inside, and not staring at the tiles for too long when it was dark. I took shorter showers. I kept the exhaust fan running more often. The shapes still appeared sometimes, but I learned to ignore them. I learned to breathe through the tension and get my routine done as fast as possible. It never completely stopped. Whenever the room got humid enough and dark enough, I would sense them forming on the walls, silent and irregular, fading as soon as I brought in more light. I told no one. I handled it alone. I had no proof and no easy explanation. I just accepted that something was trying to show itself in my bathroom using moisture and mold. I could not let it control my life. I could not leave the apartment just because of this. So I stayed, and I managed it. I watched my back, kept my hands steady, and kept a light on. That was all I could do. It started when I found that old phone in the basement. I was moving some boxes, pulling out old junk, and my flashlight caught something behind a stack of dusty crates. I saw the shape of a telephone. It had a rotary dial and a heavy handset. It felt solid and cold. I wiped the dust off with my sleeve. The cord looked frayed, but the phone itself looked like it might still work. I thought it would look interesting upstairs. I carried it to my living room and set it down on a small end table near the couch. I connected it to the wall jack. It fit, although it felt loose. I went to bed around midnight that first night. I was tired from going through all that clutter. The basement had a damp smell and I felt it in my lungs. Upstairs, the air felt better. I slept lightly. Sometime in the early morning, maybe around 3 a.m., I heard a ringing sound. I opened my eyes and sat up. It was the old phone. The ring was sharp and loud, like a short buzz that repeated every few seconds. I stood in the dark for a moment, not sure what to do. My bedroom light was off, and the hallway was quiet. I walked over to the living room, feeling the wooden floor under my feet. I flipped the light switch and approached the phone. I lifted the handset. I didn't say anything. I waited. I listened. There was a sound like breathing on the other end. It was slow, controlled, and steady. No words, no static, just someone breathing in and out. It made no sense. I tried to say something. I said, "Hello?" and my voice sounded rough and quiet. I heard no answer, just the breathing. I asked, "Who is this?" Nothing changed. After maybe 15 seconds, I hung up and checked the time on the clock on the wall. It was just after 3 a.m. The next day, I tried to ignore it. I went to work. I came home, ate dinner, watched some TV, and went to bed at a decent hour. I left the old phone in place. I considered unplugging it, but I wanted to see if it would ring again. Part of me thought maybe some old wiring in the house was causing it, or maybe the line was crossing with another. That night it rang again. Same time. I answered. The breathing again. Same slow pace. I spoke louder this time. I said, "Hey, who are you?" I got nothing. I said, "Talk to me." No response. I hung up and stood there, feeling my heart beat faster. I checked the line by picking up the handset again. There was no dial tone, nothing. On the third night, I stayed up to wait for it. I felt on edge. I left the lights off and sat in a chair in the living room. I watched the phone. It was an ugly, old thing. The rotary dial had numbers faded from use. I didn't see anything unusual about it. I tried to keep my breathing steady. Around the same time as before, it rang. I picked it up immediately. The breathing was still there. This time it changed after a few seconds. I heard a low whisper. I couldn't understand the words. It sounded like short phrases with no meaning. The voice was hushed, almost lost in the sound of breathing. I said, "What do you want?" The whispering stopped, replaced again by slow breathing. I hung up. I felt a tightness in my chest and a dryness in my mouth. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. I thought about unplugging it. I got out of bed and went to the phone. I pulled the cord from the wall. It came out easily. I checked the connection. I carried the phone back down to the basement and left it in a corner. I went upstairs and tried to sleep. I managed to close my eyes for a few hours, but I woke up again at around 5 a.m. I felt anxious. I went downstairs to see if everything was normal. The phone was not in the basement corner where I left it. I searched for it. I checked every box, looked behind shelves, and opened the door to the storage room. Nothing. I couldn't find it. I told myself I must have misplaced it. I went upstairs and checked my living room. It was back on the end table. It sat there, silent. The next night it rang again. I had left it plugged in after seeing it back upstairs. I felt I was losing control of the situation. I picked up the handset and heard whispering again. It spoke nonsense, random words, broken sentences, no structure. I tried to talk over it. I said, "Stop calling me." I said, "Who are you?" I said, "Leave me alone." The whispering continued. After I said stop, I thought I heard movement on the other end, like someone walking on a wooden floor. Then I heard a door opening and closing. I held my breath. I listened for a while. Then I hung up. Over the next few nights, it happened again and again. The phone would ring at odd hours, always late. I would pick up and I would hear breathing or whispering. Sometimes I heard distant sounds like footsteps, doors creaking, and a muffled sobbing sound. I couldn't place it. It made my skin crawl. I stopped sleeping well. I stayed awake longer. I felt tired during the day. My appetite got worse. I tried to ignore the calls. I let it ring. It would keep ringing until I answered. If I didn't answer, it would ring again 10 minutes later. I once timed it. It rang every 10 minutes until I picked it up. After I answered, I would get the breathing and the nonsense whispering. I tried to unplug it again. I pulled the cord from the wall. I coiled the cord around the phone and put it in a closet. I locked the closet door. I went to bed. I heard ringing. I got out of bed and turned on all the lights. The sound was definitely coming from the living room. I opened the closet door. The phone was on the end table again, plugged in as before. I tried to ignore the impossibility of this. I just answered the call, heard the nonsense, and hung up. I felt sweat running down my back. I tried smashing the phone. I grabbed a hammer and struck it. I expected it to crack, but the hammer bounced off with a dull thud. I hit it again. Nothing happened. I tried to pry it open with a screwdriver. The screws wouldn't turn. I tried with pliers. Nothing worked. The phone remained intact. I became frustrated. I cursed at it. I screamed into the handset. No response, just the breathing and whispering when it rang. I considered throwing it out. I took it outside and threw it in a metal trash can. I closed the lid. I went back inside and locked the door. I checked the living room. It was there on the end table, the same position. I felt a heaviness in my chest. My throat felt tight. By this time, my nights were a mess. I would wake up every hour expecting the ring. Sometimes it would wait until 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. Sometimes it would ring at 1 a.m. I could never predict it. The lack of sleep made my head ache. My eyes burned. I felt weak and shaky. I tried stuffing my ears with cotton, but the sound seemed to cut right through. I tried turning up the TV volume, but I could still hear the ring. I tried leaving the house at night, but I'd come back and find the phone ringing. I wondered if anyone else could hear it. I asked my neighbor if he heard a phone ringing late at night. He said no. I stopped asking. It felt pointless. On one particularly bad night, around 4 a.m., after days of sleep deprivation, I picked up the phone and tried to make sense of the whispering. I held the handset tight against my ear. The whispering was low, rapid, and broken. I focused on the sounds. I tried to catch a phrase or a word that made sense. It was hard. The voice sounded like a man or a woman, I couldn't tell. Maybe it was both. It sounded like multiple voices layered together. They spoke in a low monotone. Occasionally, I heard a small gasp or a soft moan in the background. I listened for a full minute before saying anything. Then I said, "What do you want?" I tried to keep my voice steady. The whispering continued without pause. I said, "Stop calling me." Nothing changed. I said, "I'm going to unplug you." The whispering stopped for 1 second, then resumed. I slammed the handset down and felt my heart racing. I paced the living room. I turned all the lights on. I went to the kitchen and drank water straight from the faucet. I tried sleeping in the guest room, hoping it would make a difference. It didn't. The phone's ring reached every corner of the house. I could hear it through the pillows I pressed against my ears. I tried sleeping in the car once. I drove a few blocks away and parked under a streetlight. I leaned the seat back. After a few minutes, I thought I heard a muffled ring. I tried to ignore it. Then it got louder. I started the car and drove around the block. Still, I heard the ring in my head. I returned home and found the phone silent, just sitting there. Later that night, it started ringing again. I answered it. The whispering sounded louder now. I heard footsteps and doors opening and closing. It sounded like someone walking through rooms, checking them. I felt a chill on my arms. I hung up immediately. I tried to move the phone to different spots in the house. I placed it in the bathroom, behind the toilet. It rang. I answered it there, standing on the cold tile floor. The whispering was the same. I heard a thump in the background like something hitting a table. I hung up and left the bathroom. The phone was back on the end table in the living room when I returned. I tried removing its cord again, but the phone always ended up reconnected. I started keeping all the lights on in the house at night. I wanted to see everything clearly. I couldn't sleep well in bright light, but I preferred that over darkness. I sat on the couch and watched the phone. I ate snacks to stay awake. My stomach felt sour from junk food and stress. My hands shook when I picked up a glass of water. I felt short-tempered. I yelled at the phone when it rang. I started answering it before the second ring, shouting into the handset. The whispering never changed. It never responded to my voice. I considered calling someone for help, maybe a phone company technician. But how would I explain this? I had no proof. The phone had no brand label. The line coming from it looked old and worn. The wall jack looked normal. My cell phone had a normal signal, nothing strange there. This old phone was a separate thing. The whispering sometimes had pauses. During these pauses, I would only hear breathing. Other times, I heard muffled crying. The crying sounded like an adult trying not to be heard. The steps always sounded distant. I tried saying hello in different tones, hoping to provoke a reaction. Nothing changed. I tried letting the whispering go on for several minutes to see if it would stop on its own. It never did. It just went on and on. After a while, I would hang up because my ear hurt from pressing the handset too hard. I bought earplugs, but I could still hear the ring at night. I tried blasting music through headphones, but I would catch the ring even through the noise. When I answered, the whispering continued as if nothing else existed. I tried to record the calls on my cell phone, holding it near the handset. The recordings came out silent. I played them back and heard nothing, just my breathing. I spent my days feeling drained. I worried about work. I worried about my health. I had no idea what to do. The phone would not break, would not disappear, and would not stop calling. I lost track of how many nights this went on. I stopped checking the time. It always felt late. My eyes stung, my head pounded. I felt sweat on my forehead for no reason. One night, after weeks of this, I tried something new. When the phone rang, I answered. I put the handset down on the table without hanging up and left it off the hook. I wanted to see if the whispering would go on forever. I listened from a distance. It was steady. The same nonsense phrases, the same quiet breaths, the same occasional footsteps, and that soft crying noise. I watched the handset as if it might move. It just sat there. After a few minutes, I picked it up and said nothing. The whispering was still going. I slammed it down. The line went dead. I stepped back, expecting it to ring again. It didn't ring for a full hour. I thought maybe I had broken the pattern. I tried to sleep. As soon as I closed my eyes, it rang again. I jumped out of bed, heart pounding, and ran into the living room. I picked up, listened to the nonsense, and hung up. I pressed my palms against my face and sat on the floor. I felt the wooden floor under my legs. I heard a faint hum from the refrigerator in the kitchen. I saw the phone on the end table. I saw my reflection in the TV screen. My face looked worn out, eyes red, hair messy. The phone rang again. I answered, heard the same whispers. I hung up. I waited, and it rang again. I answered again. I hung up. It became a cycle. Every time I hung up, it would wait a few seconds and then ring again. I kept answering and hanging up over and over. My throat hurt from breathing hard. I tried to pace my breathing, but I couldn't control it. My heart felt like it was pounding in my ears. I slammed the handset down repeatedly. Eventually, it stopped for a few minutes. The next night, I tried leaving the house before it started ringing. I wandered around my block. The streets were quiet. I walked for almost an hour. When I came back, I saw through my window that the phone was off the hook. I hadn't touched it. I went inside and heard a faint whispering sound coming from the handset, just hanging there. I picked it up and listened. Same nonsense, same breathing. I hung up. It rang immediately. I answered and hung up. I leaned against the wall. I felt a cramp in my stomach. I gritted my teeth. I tried to focus on small tasks, like folding a blanket. The phone rang. I answered. It whispered. I hung up. This became my life. No matter what I tried, the phone would ring. If I ignored it, it would ring until I gave in. If I answered, I would hear the same sounds. I tried shouting into it, pleading with it, threatening it, crying into the handset, but it made no difference. It never changed. It never escalated into words I could understand. It never turned into a normal conversation. It never ended. The noises in the background never formed a pattern I could recognize. It was always just a cycle of nonsense and strange sounds. I lost track of time. I lived with the lights on, waiting for the ringing and answering it. I tried not to think about explanations. I stopped trying to break the phone. I stopped trying to throw it away. I stopped trying to escape it. I just answered it. It rang. I picked up. I heard what I always heard. I hung up. My body felt heavier every day. My eyes burned constantly. My head ached. I had trouble focusing on anything else. The phone kept pulling me in, forcing me to pay attention to it. I tried to stay calm and quiet, but it never mattered. Now the phone sits on the end table, silent for the moment. I am sitting a few feet away, watching it. My ears are tuned to its ring. When it starts, I will have no choice but to answer. I know what I will hear. I know it will make no sense. I know I can't break it or remove it. I just wait and endure it. It always comes back. I remember the first time I stepped into that forest at night. I was not looking for anything special, just a quiet place to walk after a long day. I had a flashlight in my hand, and I could see my breath in the air. The path behind my house was familiar, but at night it looked different. The trees were dark shapes and the undergrowth rustled with every small movement. I stopped a few yards in and listened. I did not hear the usual sounds of insects or small animals. Instead, I heard a dull scraping sound coming from somewhere ahead. My heart started pounding harder. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and moved forward, trying to keep my steps soft. Each time I lifted my foot, I paused and waited, expecting something to jump out. Nothing did. A few nights later, I went out again. I told myself I was just taking a walk, but I knew I wanted to find that sound. It was a stupid idea, but I could not shake the feeling that something was watching me. I followed the same trail, turning left at the old stump and passing the large boulder that always looked like a hunched animal. I moved slowly, keeping my flashlight beam low. At some point, the wind blew from my right and carried a faint laugh. It was not a human laugh. It was too quiet and quick, like someone trying not to be heard. I stopped and tried to pinpoint the direction. I could not. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. I stood there, breathing through my nose, feeling a tightness in my chest. I wanted to leave, but I took another step forward. Each night I returned, I noticed more details. There were scratches on the tree trunks. They were thin and shallow. Some formed patterns like intersecting lines. Others were long single strokes. I ran my fingertip over one. The bark felt rough, and a few flakes fell at my touch. I looked around, shining my light on the nearby trees, seeing similar marks at different heights. They were too high for a normal animal. They almost looked intentional. I whispered to myself that maybe it was just some odd animal behavior. I tried to think of the animals I knew. None made me feel better. Over the following days, I started finding footprints. The ground in some parts of the forest was soft, especially after light rain. I found a set of tracks that made no sense. They were not round like a deer's hoof or long like a dog's paw. They looked uneven. One print was deeper than the next, as if the creature favored one side of its body. The shape was unclear. I crouched down with my flashlight, trying to see toe marks or claws. I only saw an odd, uneven shape. The prints led off the path, through thick ferns and dead leaves. I followed them for a while, but they disappeared near a cluster of tangled roots. I stood up and looked around. I saw nothing but darkness and shifting shadows. I tried not to think about the laughter I heard before, but I could not block it out. After a week, something changed. The nights grew colder, and the air felt heavier. When I walked into the forest, the place seemed quieter. There were no distant animal calls. There were no footsteps other than my own. I noticed a faint blue glow in one corner of the forest. At first, I thought I imagined it. I turned off my flashlight and waited for my eyes to adjust. I saw a slight glow, like someone had placed a piece of dull blue glass on the ground. It was too far to see clearly. I did not move toward it. I was afraid to leave the main path. My heart beat faster as I stood there. I thought I heard that muffled laugh again, but this time it came from behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight at every trunk. I saw only bark and moss. I started bringing equipment with me. I brought a small compass. I wanted to keep track of my direction. The first night I brought it, I held it close to my flashlight beam. I watched the needle swing and settle. I knew the trail ran roughly south from my house, so I expected the compass to reflect that. The needle was steady for a moment, then it jerked and spun. I tapped it with my finger. It made no difference. I moved a few steps and tried again. The needle pointed in random directions. I stepped back to the starting point. The compass was useless. I shoved it in my pocket and focused on remembering landmarks. But after a few nights, even the landmarks seemed off. The old stump looked shorter. The large boulder did not show up where I expected it. At times, I would swear the path curved in the wrong direction. My breathing would get shallow. My palms would sweat. I wiped them on my pants and forced myself to stay calm. I kept moving even when I was not sure I was heading the right way. At one point, I tried to leave pieces of cloth tied to branches to mark my route. I tore some old rags into strips and knotted them tight. On my next trip, I looked for them. All were gone. I tried leaving small stones piled near distinctive trees. The next day, the stones were scattered. I tried scratching marks into the dirt with a stick. I returned the next night and found no signs of my marks. It felt like something followed my steps and erased them. My stomach clenched each time I realized my efforts meant nothing. I would shine my flashlight all around, pressing my teeth together. The wind would pick up and carry faint noises. Sometimes it sounded like breathing. Sometimes it sounded like footsteps on dry leaves. I never saw anyone or anything. I stopped telling myself it was just an animal. It moved things and messed with my direction. I wanted to catch it by surprise. I tried sitting quietly behind a tree, turning off my flashlight and waiting. I crouched there, my knees hurting after a while, gripping the flashlight so hard my hand ached. I listened for movement. I listened for breathing. I smelled the damp soil and felt cool air on my face. After about an hour, I turned on the flashlight and looked around. Nothing changed. I tried this several times, always with the same result. I never caught it in the act. On one particular night, I decided to walk deeper than before. I knew it was risky. I carried a stronger flashlight and wore sturdier boots. I moved slowly, keeping track of the turns I took. I reached a point where the trees were thinner. The moon was out, and I could see my surroundings a bit better. The ground was soft and covered in short, wet grass. I noticed fresh scratches on a fallen log. They formed a series of short vertical lines. I ran my fingertip over them. They felt recent. The wood under the bark was still moist. I heard a quiet scraping sound nearby. It was like something dragging across a rough surface. I stood and turned toward the sound. My heart thumped and I tightened my jaw. I forced myself to take small steps forward. A branch snapped under my boot and the scraping stopped. I aimed my flashlight at the trees ahead, searching for movement. I saw a shape move to my left, just outside the beam. I swung the light around, but there was nothing there. I felt a sharp chill in my back and had trouble breathing normally. I decided to try another approach the next time. I brought a small notepad and a pen. I would write down any changes I noticed and try to piece together a pattern. I wrote down the direction of the wind, the approximate time, the condition of the ground, and the position of certain landmarks. After a few nights, my notes made no sense. Directions did not match the compass. Distances between landmarks changed. The footprints appeared in different patterns. The blue glow sometimes appeared and sometimes did not. I had no explanation. Reading my notes made me uneasy. It reminded me that something was interfering with my perception. Maybe it was moving the landmarks themselves. Maybe it was leading me around in circles. I pressed my fingers against my temples and closed my eyes for a few seconds before continuing my walk. I tried to calm my breathing and focus on one step at a time. One night, the glow appeared closer to the path. I could see it through some low branches about 20 feet away. It was about the size of my palm. I approached it slowly, bending down to avoid making noise. It was not bright enough to light the ground, but I could see it clearly as a pale, bluish spot in the darkness. When I got closer, I realized it was not a light floating in the air. It was something on the ground, like a small patch of faintly glowing material. I reached out with a stick and poked at it. The glow flickered and then went dark. I heard laughter on my right side, very close. I jerked my head around, shining my flashlight into the foliage. There was a thick bush there, and I saw the leaves shaking as if something had just moved through them. I stood up quickly, my legs tense. The laughter faded and I heard a scraping sound behind me. I spun around again, shining my flashlight everywhere. I saw only empty space and unmoving plants. I backed away, stumbling a bit on uneven ground. My pulse was racing, and I felt sweat on my forehead. I started to notice changes at home, too. After one late walk, I came back and placed my flashlight on the kitchen table. The next morning, I found it in the living room on the couch. I did not remember putting it there. I assumed I was just tired. Another time, I left my boots by the door. The next afternoon, I found them outside on the porch. I checked if the door was locked. It was. I had no explanation. I tried to ignore these things, but they kept happening. Small objects moved from one room to another when I was not paying attention. I tried to watch them. I sat in the kitchen for a while, staring at my flashlight on the table. Nothing happened. When I blinked, it was still there. Eventually, I got up to get a drink of water. When I turned back, the flashlight was gone. I found it 5 minutes later on a shelf by the back door. I had no memory of touching it. I felt lightheaded and took deep breaths until my stomach settled. I went to the forest again that night, determined to see something clear and undeniable. I followed my usual route, stepping carefully over roots and pushing aside low branches. I felt a tension in my neck and shoulders. My muscles were tight, and I had to pause occasionally to stretch my arms and roll my shoulders. The air was cold, and my nose ran a bit. I wiped it with my sleeve. The night was silent, except for my steps. I reached an area where the path split into two. I knew the left way led back toward my house, and the right way led deeper into unknown territory. My compass was useless, so I relied on my memory. I took the right path. I did not have a clear reason. I just wanted to see if something new would happen. After about 10 minutes, I found myself in a place I did not recognize. The trees were taller, and the ground was uneven. I stepped in a shallow puddle and felt cold water seep into my boot. I cursed under my breath and tried to shake off the moisture. I saw the blue glow again, this time behind a large tree. I moved closer. The glow went out. I looked down and saw fresh footprints in the mud. They were the same odd shape as before. I crouched and pressed my fingertips into one print. The mud felt cool and smooth. I looked up and saw that the footprints led around the tree and then vanished. I circled the tree with my flashlight. There was no sign of anything climbing it or hiding behind it. I stood there, frowning, my heart still beating fast, but not as hard as before. I took a few steps backward. My foot hit a loose branch and I stumbled. I caught myself with my left hand on the trunk of another tree. I heard a quiet scraping sound to my left. I pointed my flashlight there and saw bark shavings falling from a tree trunk. It looked like something was scraping it right now, but I saw no tool or claw. I reached out and tried to feel the surface. My fingertips touched rough bark. Nothing unusual. But when I took my hand away and shone the light back, I saw new scratches that were not there a second before. My breathing got shallow. My throat felt tight. I backed up quickly, almost tripping again. I did not bother trying to figure it out. I just wanted to leave. I turned around and tried to find my way back to the split in the path. I walked for several minutes, passing what looked like the same clump of ferns again and again. My flashlight beam wavered as my hand shook. I felt sweat on my lower back and tried to calm down. Eventually, I found a familiar mark, a large tree with a broken branch about 10 feet up. I remembered seeing it on my way in. I headed in that direction, moving faster than before. My boot slid a bit on damp leaves, and I had to grab a trunk to steady myself. I heard laughter again, faint and muffled, as if it came from behind several layers of foliage. I ignored it. I kept walking until I reached another familiar spot, a cluster of flat rocks near the path. I turned the flashlight off and on again, just to ensure it was still working properly. It was. The laughter stopped. The forest was silent. I walked toward where I thought my house should be. After a few minutes, I recognized the large boulder near the start of the trail. I felt a wave of relief and stepped onto more familiar ground. I exited the forest with my heart still racing. Back home, I locked every door and window. I stood in my living room, catching my breath. My legs felt weak and my hands shook. I ran them through my hair and tried to steady them by clenching and unclenching my fists. I leaned against the wall and listened for anything unusual inside the house. Everything was quiet. I did not notice anything out of place at first. After a few minutes, I turned on more lights and looked around. I found my notepad lying on the floor near the back door. I had left it on the kitchen table. I picked it up and flipped through the pages. All my notes were intact, but now there were odd pencil marks added here and there. Tiny scratches on the paper's surface. They formed no words, just meaningless lines. I closed the notepad and placed it on a shelf. I sat down, breathing slowly, trying to calm the trembling in my chest. The next evening, I stayed inside. I listened through the walls, trying to hear something outside. I heard the wind, a distant rustling of leaves, and maybe a faint scraping sound far away. I did not go out. My mind was too unsettled. I paced around, checking the front and back doors, making sure they were locked. I turned on the porch light and looked outside. The yard was empty. No tracks, no glowing patches, no movement. But I could not shake the feeling that something was there, just out of view. I lay awake in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to my own heartbeat. I still do not know what it wants. It never showed itself clearly. It never attacked me. It just played with my direction, my objects, and my mind. It scattered footprints and strange scratches, moved my belongings, and made faint noises. It made me feel trapped in familiar places. It made my compass spin and my landmarks shift. It made me hesitate before every step, holding my breath and tightening my grip on my flashlight. I have no answers, just these notes and these memories of nights in that forest. For now, I will stay inside, listen, and wait. Maybe it will lose interest, maybe it will move on. I do not know. All I know is that I do not want to return to that forest tonight. I found the chest on a warm afternoon when I was clearing out the old barn behind my uncle's house. I had never noticed it before. It was buried in dust, shoved into a corner beneath some broken planks and old tools. It was covered in heavy chains that looked rusted and tight. The wood of the chest looked damp and rotten. The barn had a stale smell, like mold and old hay, but the chest gave off a different smell. It reminded me of wet soil, and something that made my throat feel dry. I did not like the feeling, but I did not back away. I felt a weird sense of pressure in my ears when I stood close to it, as if the air around it was heavier than the rest of the barn. I tried to shine my flashlight on it, but the barn was already dim, and my flashlight started to flicker. I smacked it a few times against my palm until it steadied. The chest was about the size of a large footlocker. The chains were thick and old-fashioned, with a large padlock at the front. The lock looked older than any I had ever seen. The metal was dark and dull. I ran my fingers over it and the chains. They were cold to the touch, and I felt my fingertips prickle. I was not sure how long the chest had been there. My uncle never mentioned it. He was old and forgetful, but this seemed like something you would remember. I crouched in front of it and pressed my ear against the wood. It did not sound hollow. I could not make out anything. I felt silly, but there was a strange warmth coming off the wood. It was not comfortable. It felt like holding your hand too close to a candle flame. My eyes started to itch. I pulled back and wiped my face with my shirt sleeve. That night, I could not stop thinking about the chest. I left it in the barn and headed back to the small house where I was staying. As I ate a quick meal, I caught myself glancing out the window toward the barn. I was on edge. My shoulders were tense and my jaw felt tight. I tried to watch some old TV shows on a dusty television set, but my mind kept wandering. I felt a dull ache in my stomach, as if I had swallowed something heavy. When the night got quiet, I went to bed. I could not sleep well. I kept waking up. At one point, I sat up in bed and listened. I could hear something outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind against the barn's loose boards, but then I heard a soft clanking sound, like metal being shaken. I got out of bed and put my ear against the window. I heard the rattling of chains. It sounded exactly like the chains around that chest. I also heard a scraping noise like fingernails on a wooden surface. The sound made my teeth clench. I told myself it was my imagination, or maybe the wind had knocked something over, but I could not relax. I paced around the house for at least an hour before I dared to look outside. I opened the door a crack and looked into the darkness. The barn was about 30 yards away. The night was silent except for the usual distant rustle of leaves and a faint chirp of some nocturnal insect. I stood there, breathing slowly. My heart was beating a little too fast. I did not want to believe I had heard anything unusual, but as I watched, I saw a faint glow from one of the barn's windows. It was not a bright light, more like a soft flicker. Then it went away. I shut the door and locked it. I felt sweat on my neck. The next morning, I was angry at myself for feeling so jumpy. I decided to open the chest. I took some tools to the barn. I brought a crowbar, a hammer, and a heavy-duty pair of bolt cutters. The barn was quiet in the daylight. The chest looked the same, except the chains seemed pulled tighter. I could not tell if it was my imagination. The padlock looked firmly in place. I grabbed the bolt cutters and tried to cut through one of the links. The metal would not give. I squeezed the cutters until my wrists hurt, but nothing happened. I tried the crowbar next, wedging it against the lock and pushing with all my weight. The lock did not move. My arms started shaking from the effort. I slammed the hammer against the chain and the lock several times. All it did was send painful vibrations up my arm. I stepped back and rubbed my hands together. I was breathing heavily. I wiped sweat from my forehead. The chest just sat there. I hit it a couple of times with my boot out of frustration. The wood felt strange under my foot. I noticed that the chest did not dent or crack even though it looked rotten. I got close and smelled it again. The odor was stronger. It made me cough. I stepped away and took a deep breath of fresher air. My heart felt uneasy, and I could not figure out why. I stood there, rubbing the back of my neck, trying to plan my next move. Over the next few days, I kept trying to find a way to open the chest. Each night, I heard the chains rattle. Sometimes, when I turned off all the lights in the house and looked out the window, I could see a dark shape moving inside the barn. The shape was not clear. It was like a shadow on the wall. It had a head, shoulders, and arms. It did not move like a person. It just sort of shifted in place. I would watch it until my eyes teared up from staring too long. Then I would switch on the porch light and the shape would be gone. When I approached the chest each morning, the air around it felt heavier. My shoulders would tighten, and I would get a slight headache if I stood too close. The chest seemed warm, as if something inside was heating it. I put my hand on it once. My palm felt hot, and I pulled it back. As soon as I touched it, I thought I heard a low voice inside my head. It sounded like someone whispering from behind a thick wall. It was not clear. It made my scalp tingle. I stepped back and shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. I tried using power tools. I brought an electric grinder and tried to grind through the lock. The power in the barn flickered and the grinder's disc snapped. A shard flew past my shoulder and cut into a wooden beam. I almost dropped the tool. I cursed and turned it off. The chest just sat there. I kicked at a pile of straw, feeling angry and stupid. I did not understand why I was so determined to open it, but I could not leave it alone. It was like an itch I could not scratch. At night, the sounds got worse. The chains rattled more often. I heard a soft tapping sound like knuckles on wood. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking that I might be losing my mind. My stomach was in knots. My arms and legs felt tense. I noticed small changes around the house. The air seemed less fresh. The tap water had a slight metallic taste. My tools felt heavier. The old walls creaked more often. I tried to ignore these things, but I could not. On the 5th night, I worked up the nerve to go to the barn in the dark. I carried a flashlight and a pry bar. The barn's door creaked when I pushed it open. I turned the flashlight on and aimed it at the corner. The chest was there, its chains glinting slightly. I stepped closer and saw something move behind the chest. I jumped back, my heart pounding. I shone the light around. There was nothing there, just some old shelves and a wooden ladder. But I felt watched. I kneeled down in front of the chest and reached for the lock. I pulled on it and twisted it, trying to see if it had any give. Suddenly I heard a guttural sound. It sounded like a voice choking on thick liquid. I jerked my hand back. My legs felt weak. The sound seemed to come from inside the chest. I stood up and swung the flashlight around again. The barn's interior looked the same. No one there. I looked at the chest again. The chains rattled on their own. I heard a low laugh. It sounded like someone mocking me, but there was no one around. I backed away slowly, keeping my flashlight trained on the chest. My head hurt. My temples throbbed. I felt sweat trickle down my back. I walked out of the barn, closed the door, and walked briskly back to the house. I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, breathing hard. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, like I had been holding my breath too long. My hands were shaking. I turned on every light in the house and sat at the kitchen table, looking at my tools scattered around. I realized my bolt cutters were still in the barn, near the chest. I did not plan to go back for them that night. In the morning, I went to town and bought new tools. I bought a bigger set of bolt cutters, a heavy sledgehammer, and a handheld acetylene torch kit. I wanted to try everything. I felt ridiculous hauling all this gear for one lock, but I had to do it. I did not tell anyone. I did not want to explain what I was dealing with. I just knew I had to break that lock or go crazy. I waited until midday, when the barn was warm and bright. I opened the doors wide to let in as much sunlight as possible. I approached the chest and set down my tools. I tried the bolt cutters first. I put all my strength into it. The metal did not bend. I grabbed the sledgehammer and hit the lock several times. My arms ached. The lock did not crack. I lit the acetylene torch and aimed the flame at the lock. The metal turned red, and I felt a spark of hope. I kept heating it until it glowed. Then I tried the bolt cutters again. The cutters slipped, and I nearly fell over. The lock was not soft. It was as hard as ever. I hammered it again, but it stayed solid. As I worked, I heard low grunts and clicking sounds. They seemed to come from behind the walls, or maybe from inside the ground. I looked around, feeling nervous. I could not see anything strange, but I felt my scalp tighten. I looked at the chest. Something felt off about its texture. When I ran my hand over the wood, it did not feel like normal wood anymore. It felt denser with a slight vibration. I pulled my hand away and my fingers tingled as if I had touched a live wire. Over the next few hours, I tried every tool I had. Nothing worked. I was drenched in sweat. My arms were sore. I felt lightheaded. The chest sat there unchanged. I sat down on a stool and stared at it. My mouth was dry and my clothes stuck to my skin. I noticed that the barn was quiet now. I could not hear birds outside. The air was thick and stale. When I tried to swallow, my throat felt tight. I decided to try something else. I grabbed a long metal chisel and wedged it between the wood and the chain. I tried to create leverage. I pushed and twisted the chisel, hoping to pry the chain loose. The chisel slipped and cut into my palm. I hissed and dropped it. My hand bled a little. I wrapped it in a rag and cursed under my breath. The chest remained sealed. The chain looked untouched. I kicked the ground in frustration. Dust rose up, irritating my eyes. I felt a wave of anger. I grabbed the sledgehammer again and started hitting the chain repeatedly. Each strike sent a shock through my arms. I ground my teeth and kept going until I was out of breath. The chain did not break. The lock did not bend. The chest just sat there, warm and heavy. I could smell that sickening odor again. It made me gag. I coughed into my sleeve and stepped back, dizzy. As I backed away, the chains rattled again, but I was not touching them. The laugh returned, low and mocking. My hands clenched. I shouted at the chest to open, even though I knew that made no sense. I felt like a fool shouting at a piece of wood and metal, but I had to let it out. My voice sounded shaky. My heart was pounding. I walked outside, took deep breaths, and tried to calm down. The sunlight felt too bright on my eyes. I looked around the property. It was quiet. The old fence, the dirt path, the empty fields, all unchanged. The barn stood there, and inside was that impossible chest. I felt trapped by it, as if I could not leave until I solved it. But I could not figure out a solution. After resting a bit, I went back inside the barn and stood in front of the chest again. I moved slowly, keeping my distance. I noticed something new. The surface of the wood was moving slightly. It was not obvious, but when I looked closely, it seemed to shift like small vibrations. I reached out and hovered my hand over it. The heat was there, radiating through the air. I did not touch it. I turned off my flashlight and let my eyes adjust to the dim light coming through the barn door. As I did, I saw a shape on the wall. It was a human-like shadow. It had a head, a torso, arms, and legs. It stood still. There was nothing in the barn that could create that shadow. I looked behind me. Nothing. I looked around the rafters. Nothing. But the shadow remained. I felt my chest tighten and my breathing go shallow. My skin crawled. I fought the urge to run out. I just stood there, frozen, staring at that shadow. Then the shadow's head turned slightly as if it was looking at me. I stumbled backward, knocking over a bucket. The clang startled me and I turned the flashlight back on, shining it at the wall. The shadow was gone. I looked at the chest. The chains rattled again. I heard that guttural voice inside my mind and my vision blurred for a second. I steadied myself against a beam and took slow breaths. My legs felt weak. My hands were clammy and slippery. I decided then I could not open it. I had tried everything. I did not know what was inside, and now I was certain I did not want to know. My heart was pounding, and I felt a slight pain in my side from all the exertion. I had to walk away. The chest would stay locked. I was not going to break it, not with any tool I had. I backed out of the barn, grabbed my remaining tools, and closed the doors. I stood outside, feeling the sun on my face and breathing the outside air. I felt a dull ache in my head. I heard nothing but silence. My throat was dry and I coughed a few times. My clothes were dirty and sweaty. I looked at the barn from a distance. It stood there, as it always had, quiet and sturdy. Inside it, that chest remained locked with those old chains. I did not know what was inside. I did not know what caused the rattling chains, the scratching sounds, the shadow, or the voices. I only knew I could not open it, and I did not want to hear that laughter again. I walked back to the house feeling worn out. I decided I would leave it alone. The chest would stay there, chained and sealed. I felt a slight trembling in my hands as I turned the doorknob to go inside the house. I locked the door behind me and sat at the table, breathing slowly, waiting for my heartbeat to calm down. I pushed open the attic door and stepped inside because I needed to look for an old box of photographs. I had been putting it off for weeks, but I had a free afternoon and decided it was time to get it done. The attic was supposed to be small. I remembered its shape well enough. A cramped space with low beams, old cardboard boxes, and a few suitcases. Instead, when I went up that day, I noticed something was different. The door creaked as I opened it, and I expected the usual dusty air and dim light. But I saw more than I should have. There was more space and more depth. I could not see the far wall. The air smelled stale and felt colder than usual. I tried to flick on the single bulb overhead, but I did not find a switch in the usual place. I turned on my flashlight app on my phone and took a step forward. As soon as I entered, I saw a long corridor extending beyond where I expected the attic walls to be. This corridor was made of old wooden planks. They looked like they had been there for decades. I saw no wires, no pipes, nothing that explained why this space was there. I knew my house was old, but this made no sense. I stood still, holding my phone up, shining the light around. I saw piles of boxes stacked on the sides of the corridor. They were dusty and unlabeled. I stepped closer to one and tried to open it. It was sealed shut. I touched the tape and felt it crack as if it had turned brittle with age. I did not open it. I felt uneasy doing that. I took a few steps further and heard a creak. The boards under my feet bent slightly. They felt solid, but it sounded like someone walking right behind me. I turned around and saw nothing. I could still see the door I had entered through, just a few steps behind me. The light from downstairs was visible. That comforted me. I decided to keep going a bit. I walked maybe 5 steps more, and the corridor turned right. I shone my phone's light around the corner and saw another stretch of hallway. It had old shelves on one side. On the shelves were random objects, rusted metal parts, broken lamps, some wooden carvings that looked like table legs, and a few dusty books. The books had no titles on the spines. I did not touch them. I just looked around. I heard a small sound above me. It was a dull tapping. It could have been a loose beam or maybe a branch outside, except I knew I was in the center of the house's upper level. There were no branches here. I leaned forward and listened. The tapping stopped. My breathing felt tight. I did not understand what I was seeing. I knew how big my house was. This was impossible. I took a step backward, intending to return downstairs, but I felt something brush against my hair. I jerked my head up. There was a light fixture hanging from a beam, swaying gently as if it had been bumped. I did not remember it being there a second ago. I reached up to steady it. The metal was cold and smooth. I let go, and the light fixture remained still. I backed away carefully and turned toward the door. It seemed a little farther now. I raised my phone's light and saw the door frame. It was at least 10 steps behind me now, not 5 as before. I must have misjudged. I walked back, counting each step out loud. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The door was still not as close as I expected. It was like the space was stretching. My heart was pounding. The skin on my neck felt prickly and I kept swallowing. I decided to go downstairs and forget about the photographs for a while. I headed straight for the door. I did not look at anything else. I just focused on the doorway and the dim light beyond it. After I took about 12 steps, I reached it. That should have been only 5 steps total, but I did not care. I stepped out, closed the door, and sat down on the hallway floor. I felt a little dizzy. My shirt was damp under my arms and down my back. The air outside the attic felt normal. My own house lights were normal. I stood there and caught my breath. I did not mention this to anyone that day. I just tried to put it out of my mind. But the next afternoon, I felt the urge to check again. I knew what I saw had not been right. I wanted to confirm I was not imagining things. I climbed back up the stairs to the attic door. I opened it slowly and looked inside. At first, everything looked normal. I saw the familiar old suitcases and a few stacked boxes. The single overhead bulb was there. I sighed with relief. Maybe I had just been tired. I took a few steps inside, looking for the box of photographs. I remembered it being on a wooden shelf in the back. As I moved deeper, something felt off again. The angle of the roof beams did not look right. There was an unexpected corner at the far left side. I approached it. The floorboard there creaked. I pressed my hand against the wall and felt it vibrate slightly, as if hollow. I tapped it. The sound echoed. I pressed my ear to it and heard a faint scraping sound. I could not tell if it was inside the wall or behind it. I tried pushing on it. The panel gave a little, and I realized it was actually a hidden door. There was no handle, but I could push it inward. I did so, and a small passage opened. I shone my flashlight through and saw another room beyond. It was larger and dustier. There were old chairs arranged in a circle and a small table in the middle. On the table, I saw a dark stain and a candle holder with wax melted down the sides. I did not step inside yet. I just looked. The air smelled like old wood and stale breath. I held my breath and listened. No sounds, just a faint draft. I pulled back and let the panel close. I left the attic again, breathing hard, feeling confused and shaky. The next time I went up, I tried to leave a marker. I brought a roll of duct tape and stuck a piece on the floor near the door. I wanted to see if the environment changed when I was not looking. After placing the tape, I entered and looked around. This time I found another corridor that should not exist. It branched off from behind a stack of boxes I had never moved. I shone my light down that corridor and saw it ended at a door. The door looked old, heavy, and had a rounded top. There was a handle made of black metal. I reached it and tried the handle. It was locked. I pressed my ear against it. I heard a distant shuffling sound like bare feet moving on the floor. I asked, "Hello?" I felt stupid doing that, but I wanted to see if anyone was there. There was no response, just more shuffling. I backed away and returned to the main area looking for my tape marker. It was gone. I searched the floor. Nothing. I tried placing another piece and walked away for a few steps, then returned. It vanished again. I felt my throat tighten. I was sweating again, my forehead damp. I wiped it with the back of my arm and kept the flashlight moving slowly around me. The walls looked the same, but when I stood still and tried to pinpoint the exact shape of the room, I noticed subtle shifts. The corners were not consistent. The ceiling beams seemed to move slightly when I was not looking directly at them. I decided to leave. This was making my chest feel heavy, and I had a light headache forming at the base of my skull. As I turned toward the exit, I noticed that the door I had come through was not visible. Instead, I saw a stretch of attic space with shelves and boxes. I felt a surge of panic. I walked quickly in the direction I believed I had come from. I turned a corner and recognized the overhead bulb. The door was right beneath it. I let out a shaky breath and climbed down. I closed the attic door and locked it from the outside with the small latch. I did not return for 3 days. After 3 days, curiosity and frustration got the better of me. I wanted to see if I could understand this. I took a flashlight, a small notebook, a pencil, and a roll of twine. My plan was to tie the twine to the door handle at the entrance and unravel it as I moved forward. That way I could follow it back. I climbed into the attic and secured one end of the twine to the handle of the door frame. The attic looked normal at a glance, but as soon as I took a few steps away from the entrance, I saw a corridor that should not have been there. I followed it, unreeling the twine. I walked slowly, shining my flashlight on the floor and walls. Dust motes floated in the beam of light. The smell of old wood and dampness grew stronger. After maybe 20 steps, I reached a T-junction. I turned left and saw a room filled with chairs piled on top of each other. They were wooden and worn, with peeling paint. I could see no reason for them to be there. I backed out and went the other way. I kept the twine tight, but at some point I felt a tug. I looked back and saw the twine sagging. I pulled it gently. It came loose far too easily. I walked back to where I had made the turn and found that the twine ended abruptly. It looked like it had been cut clean. I bent down and ran my fingers along the end. It felt smooth. I aimed my flashlight all around. I saw no one. I listened. There was a faint scraping sound again, like something dragged on wood. I whispered, "Who's there?" and got no answer. My voice sounded weak and thin. I walked forward again, trying to keep track of my turns. I moved slowly and tried to leave small marks by scuffing my shoe on the floor. After a few minutes, I checked behind me and saw no sign of my scuff marks. It was like the floor repaired itself. My heart was thudding. My mouth felt dry. I tried to swallow, but my throat felt tight. I felt the urge to get out as soon as possible. I hurried back, guessing my way. After 2 or 3 wrong turns, I finally spotted the familiar overhead bulb in the entrance. I jumped down the ladder and slammed the attic door shut. I sat on the floor for several minutes, breathing hard, rubbing my hands on my jeans. The attic was not normal. It was bigger inside than outside. The walls and floors shifted. Doors appeared and vanished. Objects that should not be there kept showing up. I tried to think of a logical explanation. Maybe there was some strange architecture or a hidden room complex. But the way the floor stretched and the way my markers disappeared could not be normal. I felt scared and angry. I wanted to find my old photographs. They had my grandfather's pictures and some old letters from relatives. The fact that I could not even find a simple box in my own house bothered me. I tried again the following week. This time I brought a headlamp, extra batteries, a folding knife, and gloves. I wanted to feel more prepared. I also brought a small folding chair, planning to set it up near the entrance as a fixed reference point. I climbed up, placed the chair near the door, and looked around. The attic floor seemed level and quiet. I saw the usual boxes and my old suitcases. I walked toward them. I heard a creaking sound behind me and turned. The corridor was there again, but this time it started just a few feet away from my folding chair. It was like the space itself was trying to draw me in. I ignored it and opened one of the suitcases. It was empty. I opened another box. Inside were old magazines in black and white. I flipped through one. The pages were blank. I set it down. I checked another box. It contained some chipped teacups and a metal key with no teeth. None of this helped me. I looked back at the entrance. My folding chair was gone. I walked to where I had placed it. The floor was empty, no mark, no scratch. I turned around slowly, shining my headlamp on the beams above me. I saw something move at the far end of the attic. It was a shadow. I aimed my light there, but saw only a stack of boxes. I approached carefully. As I got closer, I noticed a door behind the boxes. I had not seen it before. The door was made of pale wood, with a simple round knob. I tried the knob. It opened. Inside was a small room with a dresser and a mirror on top of it. The mirror's surface was cloudy. I leaned in and wiped it with my glove. I saw my face. I looked tense, with sweat on my brow, eyes wide. Behind me, the reflection showed a shape. It was like a tall figure standing in the doorway. I turned around instantly, shining my light, but there was no one there. The doorway led back to the main attic space. I felt my heart pounding harder. My arms felt weak. I stepped away from the dresser and back into the main area. The corridor was still there, waiting. I took a few steps down it, looking at the walls. They were made of old boards, some warped, some stained. I heard a soft humming sound. I stopped and listened. It sounded like a distant machine or a slow gust of wind. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. I tried to remember the turns I took. Left, then right, then straight. Each time, the attic seemed to offer a new path or room. I found a closet filled with old coats. They smelled like mold. I found a low table with a stack of photographs that were all blank. I kept moving, trying to find something I recognized. Every few minutes, I tried to turn back, but the route changed. Instead of my entrance door, I found a narrow staircase leading up. I climbed it and ended up in another dusty hallway with a single window. I looked through the window, hoping to see the street or my neighbor's roof, but I saw only darkness. I pressed my face to the glass. It was cold and showed nothing but blackness outside. I could not guess how long I wandered. My legs started to ache. My knees felt stiff. My mouth felt dry and my stomach cramped. I had not eaten in hours, I guessed. My headlamp battery was still strong, but I worried about getting stuck in the dark. I tried calling out for help once, but my voice echoed weirdly. I heard it bounce back at me, distorted. I stopped calling. I decided to keep calm. I moved slowly, retracing my steps, trying to notice any detail I could remember. A corner with a broken chair, a shelf with a teacup, anything familiar. Eventually, I noticed a pattern. When I stood still and looked away, the environment changed more. If I kept moving and looking straight ahead, things stayed more stable. I moved steadily forward for several minutes, ignoring all side rooms and passages. Finally, I saw the attic entrance. It was a few steps away, under the original overhead bulb. I climbed down the ladder as fast as I could and slammed the door shut. I locked it and pushed a heavy trunk against it. I sat down and caught my breath. My shirt was soaked with sweat. My legs were shaking. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. I decided that I would not return to that attic. I would find another place to store my things. I would hire someone to seal it off if I had to. It was not worth the confusion, the fear, and the strange noises. Every time I went up there, the place got bigger and more complicated. It offered no real clues, no answers, just an endless series of corridors and rooms that should not exist. I never found the photographs. I left that attic alone. I still live in the same house, but I do not go up there anymore. I do not like to talk about it, and I keep that door locked. I sleep with the door to the hallway closed, and I do not look up at the ceiling at night. I try not to think about what might be rearranging itself above me while I rest. I focus on my normal rooms and my normal belongings. I know something is up there that does not follow any rule I understand, but I stay away. That is all I can do.